For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Let me hold up some rock solid evidence. Do you see that rock?
Yes.
It comes up the driveway. I take young people out on field trips, as does our Canadian rep Martin Legamati, who's not far from where your Canadian studio is. That's in COVID free time, that is. But this rock here, I was leading a group who'd never been on a field trip before, and I told them to bend down and pick up a rock. And then I said, well, what is it? And they puzzled over that for quite a while. And then one kid said, it's a rock. By the way, rock's just an old word that means hard. Nothing technical, nothing fancy. We've invented these words and they're descriptive words, one rock. And then I said, what sort of rock it is? And he didn't know. And he passed it to his friend. And I said, well, what do you think it is? And he said, I don't know. And anyway, he passed it to his friend. And I said, okay, it's now the 21st century. How would you find out what this rock is? And they puzzled for a little while. And the guy said, Google? Well, the interesting thing is most people don't see the evidence because they don't even know what they're looking for. I mean, say you find the name on Google, what does it actually mean? That's definitely a rock. How about I hold this rock up? See this one here? Now, when you look at that, that's the first stone tool I ever found. I found it in Mad Dog Creek here in Australia. Yes, we have wonderful names for places in Australia. This is off the road. Now, I've never met anybody who thinks somebody actually shaped that deliberately to be a bit of a rock on the road. Oh, yes, they know it's been crushed by a big crusher, but nobody intelligent actually made it that shape. But I've showed this to many students, to professors, and everybody says somebody who existed before it, somebody who's not a part of it, somebody who's smarter than it. It's not hard to be smarter than a rock, by the way. They actually made that. They shaped it. The evidence is overwhelming. Now, let's go one step further. You see this? Now that's very recognizable. You see the edge? Now, we go from a rock that's unshaped to my first ever so-called primitive stone axe. Whoops, I've got to get this right. We're back to front here on the camera. Right up to this very nicely shaped one that we found here in Australia. Now, we can have a wonderful lesson on the evidence of creation. Did you get the point so far? You can always recognize the creation, whether it's a fancy axe or a rough stone axe or the cobble that just has been smashed up in a machine. Key point. Somebody existed before it. Somebody who's not a part of it, somebody who's smarter than it, made a rock do things that rocks don't. I mean, you know, rocks don't do that, do they? They don't end up with nice sharp edges. They don't end up with polished sides. Rocks don't do that all by themselves. But here's a clue. You see, the people I got those rocks from here on the east coast of Australia have interesting stories about their stone tools, because I interviewed one. We have a whole series of MP4s available, the USA, Canada, etc. Just go to our main website, Creation Research. And one of them is called The Origin of the Races. The next is called Real Roots. Another one is called The History of Man. And you'll see me interviewing native elders here in Australia, Aboriginal folks, Indigenous people. And the old Aboriginal elder was showing me lots of stone tools. And, you know, the interesting thing was they just look like stone copies of our metal tools. And he said his people have a story that when they first came here, they bought metal tools. But then they discovered the spirits up in the hills and they forgot how to make and use metal. Now, there's a story that the evolutionists don't like. Or the Aborigines know the stone tools were created, they didn't happen by themselves. Or they're not as clever as God's creation of the universe or God's creation of man, but nevertheless, they didn't happen by themselves. But they also gave you a clue that they came from somewhere where there was already steel, where there was already the art to make metal. Because if you come with me to India, you'll see our Australian dingo. You'll also see weapons like this. Do you recognise the Aussie icon, the boomerang? Of course, the ones in India are not exactly shaped as nice as these ones. And the ones in India, if you throw them, they won't come back. That's why you need a dog. It's a stick, remember? Yes, thanks for your joke, mate, over there, George. There's a boomerang. And it's famous for the fact that when you throw it, it circles around and it will come back. Until you get it right. Of course, it slaps your baby brother in the head, breaks the next door neighbour's window, but it's an interesting piece of a creation. You see, you've taken wood and you made the wood do what wood won't. Now, this is a boomerang. This one here is a boomerang also. This is more like the ones you'll find in India. This one, a lovely group of Aboriginal people west of what you mostly know as Ayers Rock. You know the big rock in the middle? Those people out there, they made these for us specially. Now, this is, let me show you them so you've got the idea. That one there is a curved throwing stick and it comes back. You'll find throwing sticks more like this, even amongst the native tribes of Arizona. It's a curved stick, but it's not designed to come back. This one here, if you throw it and you aim it to hit something, it won't come back. So you've got to figure out what could you use this for to throw it at so it didn't hit it, but it would also catch it and yet it would come back. Good question. We're having a Q&A at the end. If you want to find out, you can ask me. But this one here, can I warn you? If you come to Australia and you see a big Aboriginal man and he's got one of these curved throwing sticks, but not your normal boomerang, and he's pointing it at you, can I suggest you run or you duck or you hide? Because
I've got one of those, John.
You got one of those, have you? It's not between your eyeballs, I can tell that. You see, this one is a killing stick. Now, you come with me to Ayers Rock, Uluru, in the current native political correctness. Come with me west of Ayers Rock, and you'll meet the Walpri people. Now, the Walpri people made this for us. Yes, you have to get the right shaped bit of root. You have to then shape it. You have to know aerodynamically what you want to do so it will go through the air straight to where you want to throw it. But it's not designed to come back. It's designed to kill you. All right, now think carefully. The Walpri people, what do they call this killing stick? Now, you've kept track, haven't you? Here we have our stone tool. Australian Aborigines are famous for their stone tools. Of course, as soon as the Europeans came and bought metal tools, they abandoned their stone tools everywhere. Why use a stone tool when you can get a metal one off the European so-called invaders? Well, in reality, the stone tools were part of their story that says we used to be able to make it and we came here and we forgot. The Walpri people, they also have a story about these. You see, this one here is actually called Kali. That's the name of it. You and I would call it a killing stick. They'll call it Kali. Now, how good's your background knowledge? You see, the Bible's a book, and over the years, the one thing I've learned about the whole of God's word is it's true from the beginning, and will remind you about that. The Bible never says you have to go find the evidence to convince yourself. The Bible says the evidence is everywhere, and you'll have no excuse if you end up denying it. It's so obvious, says the book of Romans. Okay, and on the East Coast, where they make those stone tools, they came from another country to here. They landed in their boats on the East Coast. The Walpris, they call the killing stick Kali. Now, I've been to India. Do you know who Kali is? Kali is the goddess of death. You go to India, they had steel before many other countries did. Their old steel towers are still there. Or perhaps I better fill you in on the rest of the stone tool story. Remember I said they had stone tools that look just like bigger versions of our metal tools? Well, watch the DVD, listen to the elder. Don't trust me just because I'm a good-looking Australian. The elder said, we came from another land over the sea after much war and fighting after the big flood. You'd say, wonder why they didn't bring steel technology with them. You know, you see this all around the world. When people are forced to leave a place, war and fighting, you take what you can grab and you get out of there real fast. They forgot how to make steel. Whoever got left behind who knew it didn't bring it to Australia. Oh, and they landed on the East Coast, not far from where we're currently doing this broadcast. In their story is evidence that they came from another people. The dogs are over there, the boomerangs are over there, the steel is over there, Kali's over there, the goddess of death. On the East Coast, they came after the big flood. And that's the subject that the guys have asked me to address today. I've discovered the evidence is not just in rocks and fossils, but it's in biology, it's in anthropology, it's everywhere. So I'm going to get my assistant, Ben, here, who is controlling all the fancy buttons. Ben, we need to swap over to the PowerPoint and fill up the screen. So I'll see you at the end for question time.
Awesome. Okay. Let me put that on the screen for you, gentlemen.
Okay. Can you see the screen, guys?
Yep. And I'm going to make it full screen and we're good to go.
Good. We're good to go. Now, here we are. Now I just need to press this, don't I, Ben? That one there. That's good. Okay, so you'll see there our main website, creationresearch.net. You'll see my young colleague, Joseph, who we've trained for 4 years and is now full-time with us. And you'll see one of his deadhead friends in the middle. He's from the European Union. That's Neanderthal. Oh, he was actually there before the European Union. So anything you want to find out about what we're doing, feel free to go to the Q&A section. There's whole encyclopedia stuff there of just about everything. We're going to take you to Jurassic Ark, the Aussie Creation Museum. 20 acres of wonderful stuff. Jurassic? No. Jurassic Park's the movie. It's all about dinosaurs, but Jurassic is a word that was invented by a guy who basically believed the Bible and he believed in Noah's flood. He was a world-famous geographer by the name of Alexander von Humboldt. Where is it? We're on the east coast of Australia. See, you're way over on the top left-hand side. We're right down the bottom right-hand side. It's near a famous gold mining town called Gympie. It's named after an Aboriginal bush, the Gympie plant. And boy, if you touch that Gympie plant, you really know it. It will sting you like crazy. Lots of gold found there in the early days, rescued our state from bankruptcy. We have people come, primary schools, your elementary schools, we have high schools, we have the public cup. We found a lot of fossils there 20 years ago. Families come and they really dig it. They enjoy finding rocks and fossils and digging them up. We even have a small model of Noah's Ark there, and you keep eyes on the big one that's coming in not too long down the track. We have a lot of beautiful Aussies. See our pretty parrots? You might be fascinated to know that one guy became really convinced because he was doing his doctorate on the origin of parrots, and he rang me up to talk about the evidence, and he was amazed. The further away you get from the Middle East, where there's very few parrots, the greater the number of parrots there are. Basically, he said it's almost as if they started in the Middle East and they took off from 3 pairs. But in reality, that's what the Bible said they did do. Beautiful birds, aren't they? Our king parrots. And families come to Jurassic Ark and they enjoy it. But we have a purpose other than just fun and facts. When I first became a Christian, the old King James was about all there was. And this was one of my favorite verses. Thy word is true from the very beginning. Now, that's a pretty much of a challenge to someone who's comes from an atheistic background, who's training in science, who's got a head full of evolution. Now, of course, we set up Jurassic Ark to remind people there are plenty of opinions. I'm old enough now to look back and say all the theories in geology I learned in Queensland University have all come and gone. And the new theories still disagree with the Bible, but the facts never do. Now, if you push me to the wall now in a debate, and that's what we do to people like Richard Dawkins and the professors over there in Canada, and all of the people who want to debate this, they've got no evidence that God's word is false from the beginning. That's why we have such a good track record of winning debates. So let me remind you what the Bible says. I do this because you'll find people who say, I couldn't believe the Bible. Hand them a Bible. Ask them what it is they can't believe about it. You find they don't even know what's in it. Number one, the world didn't happen by itself. It was created. It was perfect. It was very good. Number two, there was a fall. A well described, that word's not in the Bible, but it's a good description by the theologians. The world was created perfect. Don't blame God for anything bad. We blew it. Adam sinned. And one result was you end up with judgment. Not just the judgment of death that comes at Adam's sin, but Noah's flood as well. Noah's flood, for those of you interested, is the first great climate change. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights and had nothing to do with the Mercedes-Benz that Noah was driving full of gasoline. It was a judgment by the God who controls the weather, as was Babel. You see, the Aboriginal people who brought their boomerangs to Australia. Did you catch that? Just as the natives in Arizona brought their boomerangs to North America. Just as the Egyptians took their boomerangs to Egypt. Of course, we tidied ours up a bit and made it come back. So we ended up a little bit ahead. Didn't happen by itself. And finally, you end up with tribes and nations, and ultimately you and I who are in this program, or those of you who are watching it. Now, that's the big picture. When I debate people, I've got to be blunt. Most of them don't even know too much about evolution. They may be specialists in the microdynamics of some molecule, and they're evolutionists by arbitrary choice. So they come to Jurassic Ark and they see some of our dinosaurs. Again, go to creationresearch.net. There's two of our Queensland dinosaurs. The one on the left was found so well preserved, he still had food in his tummy. And the kids love them, don't they? Oh, and look, they can come and they can learn how to dig up. Yep, that's a real skull. There's a kid having a wonderful time. We teach them not only the facts of history, but how to find this stuff as well. And lately, we've gone virtual. Look at those high school kids. The dinosaur just pops out of nowhere. And yeah, you're right. It didn't happen by itself. Our DreamArt team, and I recommend them to you, do a wonderful job even making pterodactyls fly through the sky at Jurassic Ark. And you can photograph yourself with all of these. By the way, have you ever seen a gorilla do this? You and I create. We don't do it as well as God does. Our pterodactyls disappear as soon as you turn your app off. But God's pterodactyls, they were real. They flew. And we've even got, well, what on earth is the crowd looking at? They're looking at a dinosaur trackway that we installed there. A+ from the Aussie Dinosaur Museum. We're really pleased with that. And we even have the fossils on display. Well, notice our label there, a fossil drowned dinosaur. Now, we could spend our whole time just on dinosaurs if we like, but they want to deal with the flood, the overlap. That guy was drowned. How do we know it? You mightn't have seen a drowned body. I have. It's not nice. But the scientists quite a few years ago decided, how come so many dinosaurs end up with their necks bent back and their tails bent up? And back in November 2011, they decided time we answer this, guys, they've been drowned. How would you know they've been drowned? They did the experiments. I won't go into the gory details, but in reality, if you've got a long neck or even a short neck, if you breathe air, the last thing you do before you drown is throw your head back, open your mouth, and try and gulp in the last breath you'll ever gulp. Usually it's water, and it really is the last breath. I mean, don't take my word for it. We've known it for ages. Here we are in Canada, Daspletosaurus. We're in a big dinosaur area, and they've got signs up on these displays. Death pose. Death pose? Why is its neck back? Possibly related to drowning. Are we interpreting this the wrong way? No, they even put a mural. See the dinosaurs? Aren't there some fascinating weird ones there? That's in the mural. Let's show the rest of the mural. See on the right-hand side? There's you and me getting famous, finding an Aspletosaurus we're going to name after our mother-in-law. Yeah, they got drowned. In reality, when you look, the evidence of dinosaurs drowning is actually built into the way they've been buried. I mean, look, here's one I photographed in Bavaria. Yes, I'm truly grateful to all of our supporters who enabled us to get around and do the research everywhere. Head up, mouth open, tail over the top. Think carefully. If you're a human or a dog and you are drowned like that, you will find you not only have to be drowned, you have to be buried very quickly. Why? Because your body goes into shock when you open your mouth and breathe water in, and your back tenses and the tail comes up if you've got one. But after you're dead, very shortly, your body will relax and your tail can't do that anymore. All over the planet. And I've been to so many continents now. I'm truly grateful for the many, many decades of research and visiting from Alaska all the way down to the tip of Australia. We've got fossil dinosaurs from China. Amazing. Drown, 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 drown. One simple point. You see, time doesn't make a fossil. Time makes bodies decompose. A process of rapid burial and drowning is what makes the fossils. This is why just last year, our Dreamer team and ourselves got together and put a virtual book together for 10 years of age plus, in which you can actually not only read what happened to the dinosaurs. No, they didn't disappear in the flood. I wonder how they did disappear. Perhaps you need to buy the book or have a look at the reviews. You come to Jurassic Ark, you not only see dinosaurs, you see our giant shark's jaws. Yep, there's me right in the middle. Mega sharks? Well, there's the scuba diver beside it. Big critters. Courtesy of Dreamer. Look at that. We just installed him up there. These are fun things, by the way. Oh, that's the real size, because here's one of the pictures out of things like Scientific American. Look how big they used to be. Now look at the bottom. See the tiny scuba diver? And you and I are scared of the guy in green. Well, in reality, there are giants mentioned everywhere in the Bible. Genesis chapter 5 and 6. By the time you get to Numbers 13, there's giant grapes and giant people. And most people have never thought, I wonder if it applied to other animals as well. What's interesting about the Bible is it's not just true from the beginning, but for those of you who are Christians who, like me, struggled and said, well, could God have used evolution? Here's a nail that went into the head of that one. By the time you get to the New Testament, over and over again, it reminds you that all things were made by Christ. Christ is the creator. And when you look at that with the big picture, Christ was there in the beginning. Christ made Adam in his image. Adam sinned, and that defaced the image of God. Noah, in God's mercy, found grace. So you and I are descended from, well, we're all boat people, quite reality. We're all descendants of those who are at Babel. But you see the words on the left-hand side? The real history of the world is change. Oh, that's what evolution does. Change is true. If change is true, evolution is true. If evolution is true, the Bible is false. No, the real history of the world is change, but it's degeneration or devolution. Aren't you glad the sharks aren't that big anymore? Yep, come and visit Jurassic Ark. Get your picture taken, or visit us on the museum app there. You see, our whole purpose is to make sure we challenge your authority. Who is it? Is it God's word or man's ever-changing theories? In case you missed the point, before I finish off with this section on the flood, let's challenge you. God created. God is just a position. The name of this God is Jesus Christ. Yes, there's Father, there's Son, and there's Holy Spirit, and they're all there making sure nothing happened by accident. And you and I were made in the image of the Creator, who is Jesus Christ. We are not just animals. We are unique. We do rats to test COVID vaccine. All the best, guys. We don't have a vaccine for COVID yet, but that's a whole different issue, and I can upset a whole country that way. But you see, in reality, God didn't give the rats dominion. He didn't give the monkeys or the apes, the gorillas. He gave it to us. And then there's the key point. You see, don't you dare blame God for anything bad. You want to know what the problem in the world is? No, it's not Donald Trump, and it won't be Mr. Biden. The trouble is us. Every one of us needs to look in the mirror because we don't live in a good world anymore. This God reminds us that when he did make the world good, he made things after their kind. So don't be surprised we found this fossil at Jurassic Ark. It's a perfectly preserved tree fern. You say, come on, how do you know that? The answer is we grow them at Jurassic Ark. They're still here today. And the Bible says God created things after their kind, and Charles Darwin invented a word. You see, Darwin, theory of evolution, he basically said seaweed turned into tree ferns. He basically said amoebas turned into people, and some of them got sidetracked and turned into dinosaurs that died out 60 million years ago. But when he started to look for his evidence, he found that he couldn't find any fossil evidence. I got to agree with Charles Darwin's chapter on geology. The worst part of his theory is the fossils. But unlike Darwin, I've majored in fossils, and living fossils as well. Here's my grandson, Ben, my computer man for the day, filming one of our researchers, Dr. Diane Eager, and she's touching one of our botanical gardens evidences. She's touching a thorny plant. You see, the bad news is this God judged the world. Oh, that's why this whole subject is so unpopular. It's not just about God. If it was about creation or a flood, it'd be fine. But it's about God hating sin. And God judged sin. He cursed the ground, and thorns came and death, and the world changed. And that's the world you and I live in. Thorns and weeds. So don't be surprised when the high school students come, we deliberately get them to play with our thorny bushes. What's the name of that one? Well, it's called the crown of thorns cactus. And when the students touch it, they get amazed. You see the new thorns? They're soft. They're rubbery. It's only as it lives in a harsh environment and everything dries out that those thorns will prick you. When they first appear, they're absolutely gentle, like rubber bands, elastic. Won't do you any damage whatsoever. That's in the living world. God didn't make thorns just by creating them. He said the plants would bring them forth. Here's a fossil find. I found that fossil. You recognize what it is? You see, up on the top of the cliff, there was a modern day plant with the same structures. And there's my fossil. You can see the fossil's much bigger. Well, everybody who sees this, there's some kind of fossil thorn or prickle, and they're right. And I found them under this coal seam in Canada called Carboniferous. Oh, Carboniferous is not an age. Carboniferous just means full of carbon. That's where it came from. A reverend gentleman in England invented that word to describe the rocks around Newcastle where they dig up coal. That fossil and that leaf come from just underneath that coal seam. And I've got heaps of them for our museum. So when you have a look at all of this, yeah, I know the Bible says, and Jesus repeated it in the New Testament, you will love God with your mind. So no apologies if I'm forcing you to think that's the job God has given me to do. I'd much rather be rich and famous some days than provocative. Well, you don't make $1 million out of ministry here in Australia, I'll tell you, because just about nothing's tax deductible. But I can collect rocks. When did this rock containing fossil thorns form? You see, the God who was there reminded us that he commanded the ground to bring forth thorns because Adam disobeyed him. Soft bits become hard. He didn't invent thorns just after. He finished creation at the end of the sixth day. What was going to become thorns were already there, but nothing would fossilize until there was something to bury them. That rock formed after Adam's sin, and it could only be buried fast enough to preserve everything by the time you get to Noah's flood. Now, the next bit is the key issue. We started with Aborigines and stone tools. They brought them here after the big flood. We looked at the Kali people, the people in the Warlpiri people who used the word Kali for their killing boomerang. Evidence they came from somewhere else. Babel and the flood are in many places, not just in the Bible. And here at Jurassic Ark, well, there's me just a couple of weeks ago, the day before we had a big storm that blew those covers to smithereens. What am I doing? I'm digging it. Do you see the fossil log there? Oh, you should actually see there's two logs. One log sitting on top of the other. Notice there's neither top nor bottom to the logs. They're broken. There's just the stick. These are significant sticks. But in every case, in the acres we've sort of excavated, There's no whole tree. Dr. Diane Eager was back up a week later. She's based in Canberra, where the university is that she used to work in. She's one of our researchers, was a lecturer in medical biology. And look, here's what we excavated that day. Do you notice that most of these logs in this patch are lined up? Now, we know what the logs are. We've identified them. We've had the forestry people there. We've had the experts there. And if you like a bit of the history, we found these around about 2000. See the water in front? They'd put a dam in. We found bits of petrified wood that had turned to stone. We used the water to hose them down. Look, broken logs, stone logs, no roots, no branches. Clue number one, they didn't grow here. You recognise being a geologist is playing rock detective, don't you? And that's why Jesus said, if people ignore me, the rocks will cry out. So Charles Darwin chooses to ignore God. Richard Dawkins wants God right out of the picture. The ABC, the BBC just ignores God all the time, but they can't shut the rocks up. Oh, and our friend brought in his nice tractor here. We excavate the first patch. See the original site? There, by the time we get to 2006 as our excavation plot, 2007 we've kept on going. We had volunteers come in. Oh, Jurassic doesn't mean millions of years, and it doesn't mean dinosaurs. It means like the rocks in the Jura Mountains. And I've been there. Why would they name these rocks Jurassic? Because they have exactly the same specimens. Here's father and son. Look what they ended up excavating. Not a bad day's work, don't you think? No branches, no roots. And right up at the end where you can see Dad, there's a big rock. Now, the significance? Trees float, rocks don't. That rock was washed in. Nobody believes that rock grew on the spot into a nice round eroded block. Yeah, we did smash a bit with the bulldozer, you can see it there, but we found the bit and glued it all back together. What you find is what we've got here is a deposit. See the rock at the top? You see that log at right angles? Rocks don't float, trees do. And we find trees of huge sizes there. Look at this young student helping us out as we have a polystrate log. 2 logs, 1 smashed logs going across the strata. Nobody believes they grew there. And the biggest rocks, half a yard, nearly half a metre, 18 inches across. You know, when I do tests with sediments and with water, the one thing I find is the bigger the rock, the faster the current has to be going to move it. That's not true for logs. Logs will move even if the water's going gently because they float, but rocks don't. I think I've mentioned that before. So you can go out and run tests. You can get a big fireman's hose and turn it up and find what speed the water has to be going to shift that rock. This was not just a flood deposit. This was a violent flood deposit. See, I've got fossil flood log jam. Here's a log jam. I took that picture in Canada, over on your west side. You know, British Columbia, lots of log jams over there, sometimes natural, where they've had landslides, like in this case, and the logs have all tumbled in. You get a bit closer, and yes, I went right down to the mouth of that river, and I photographed the logs lying all along the beach. You see their front end is abraded. By now, they've lost their branches. They have no roots. That's the present day ones. Here's the fossil one. You see, all the trees in our site here have not only been picked up somewhere, they've traveled along in the water, they've rolled around, they've been abraded, they've got those pointy ends just like our modern day log jams, but there's a vastly greater number. Here's another one we dug out. And every geologist who's been there, whether they like to admit it or not, has to agree this is a flood dump. But the one flood they don't want to go to, guess what it is? You see, when I did geology at Queensland University, the first week I was there, and I didn't come from a church family, didn't come from a Christian family background, the professor said, we're not going to discuss any such rubbish as catastrophic geology, as Noah's flood. And I thought, why not? I'll be honest, it had the reverse effect on me. It was like putting up a sign that said, wet paint, don't touch. You know what I mean? So I've become a little bit more knowledgeable. We dig up some of these logs. It turns out they're southern conifers. We re-erect them. We even put them in our living fossil garden. Yes, you see the students would come and dig up the logs, but they had fun digging. I mean, much better in a pit digging a rock, bashing something than sitting in a maths lesson, don't you reckon? Then we'd erect them here. We planted all the trees around them. We made up gardens to show that the rocks have fossils in that are no different from the present day plants. Tragically, many have become extinct, but we know this is a living fossil because it still lives at Gympie. It's a southern conifer. Conifer has cones like a pine tree, but these ones today live only in the southern hemisphere. But you come with me to the Jura Mountains, the famous Solnhofen area, where I've collected a few times, you'll find they've got fossil Australian pine trees. You never get asked that, do you? How come Australia's got such unusual animals? Well, how come you've got them dead in Germany? The trees, you realise that famous fossil so-called forest over there in Arizona is southern conifers, our Australian trees, really? How big is this bed? Well, there's a diagram. You see our deposit is on the east coast. See where Brisbane's marked? See, as you go north, our deposit is up there. Now, I knew about the size of this bed before I finished university because I majored in sort of coal fossils and then lectured in coal geology. I've been to most places on this map. And a few years back, we loaded up a busload of people and we took them all around this bed to show them how big this flood deposit was. What was our indicator? Well, we were looking for trees that had no branches and no roots. And that, by the way, is I know many watching in the USA or Canada have no idea how big Australia is. That Australia is as big as the continental USA. It's not just a little part down the southern hemisphere before you move on to Antarctica or something like that. It is huge. And this is sandstone, full of fossil logs. You don't know much about sandstone? I'll give you a bit of a help. If you want to get a cubic meter of sand so you can turn it into sand, you need at least 3 cubic meters of granite to break up. Oh, that would take up much of Australia to break down the rock to produce that fossil bed that's made of sandstone. Again, I'm going to finish with a couple of statements. There are many theories and opinions that contradict everything in the Bible, but the facts don't. If you've got questions, we're coming up soon about any of this aspect or anything you can find, particularly about this point. There's the key point we've been making. The world has changed. Change is true, but the change is the opposite of evolution. It's been going from good to bad to worse, but you grab hold of evolution, then don't be surprised. Another prediction, another warning about science, a warning about knowledge. Beware of false science, says the old King James. Watch out for false knowledge, says the new translations. Science is the old Latin word for knowledge. The Greek word is gnosis. They both mean the same thing. It doesn't matter whether you want political knowledge that'll lead you astray, economic knowledge will lead you astray if it's false, even scientific knowledge will lead you astray. You see, as I grew up, I just embraced evolution because the teachers told me it was true. And you know what I realized? If evolution was true, I could do anything. And after a few years of doing anything I liked, there was nothing in it. I mean, so what? I was smart enough to get away with it. I really was. If I ever got caught, I figured out not how to change my ways. I figured out how to do the same thing again next time and not get caught. How foolish. I'll tell you what, in the end, it didn't satisfy me at all, but this did. You see, the real problem we want to do what we want is that we are no longer a perfect creation. The real trouble that Mr. Dawkins doesn't want to face up to is that he's a sinner like me, and that Jesus Christ, the last Adam, came to die. Oh, to tie the knots together as a final point, there's the overall summary from Genesis to Revelation. One man, Adam, sinned, so one man, Jesus, died. The wages of sin is paid, so don't be surprised. The last chapter of the Bible is also about the same Jesus making the new heavens and the new earth, and he won't even need to use 6 days to do that. Have you got the point? There are many theories and opinions that contradict everything in the Bible, but the facts never do. I'm going to leave that up for you to have a look at, and we're going to switch back onto the main screen now. Lots of resources there. Many are free. I'm sure they'll give you a YouTube clips and things like that where you can see search for the origin of life, and just get in touch with us and keep supporting what these guys are doing. That's what done. You can swap back from PowerPoint to subscreen now as we sort of hit the right buttons here.
There we go. Awesome presentation, Dr. Mackay. We've had a really lively audience. I love the visuals. That was a great presentation. God bless you for that.
Thank you very much, George. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here so I can get up some pretty pictures for you all to have a look at. There we go. And let's just get it up nice and big for everybody. There we are. Wonderful. Okay, so you can see creation research there. You can see John Mackay is with me there. He was on the show a little while back. You can see me. You can see our international director, John Mackay. And in between the two of us, you can see a dead head, more specifically a Neanderthal skull. And you also see our website at the bottom there, creationresearch.net, with Q&A. We've already mentioned we're going to have a Q&A session later on this evening, but if you aren't brave enough to ask a question, or if you don't think of a question that you suddenly remember in the middle of the night, you can go to creationresearch.net, click on Q&A, and we've got a whole host of questions and answers on there. And if they're not on there, then you can certainly submit one so that we can answer it for you. And we give you a little bit deeper explanation. And George did a fantastic job of sort of introducing who I am and what I do. I'm the director of Creation Research UK, and I speak all over the world at wonderful places. This was a school a little while back, which we were speaking on snakes. You can sort of see a snake in the picture that I'm using behind me there. You see, my background, my main academic background is in, as was already been mentioned, paleobiology. So we look at fossils and we try and match them up to living things. We use our knowledge of living things to actually help us interpret the past. And specifically what we're supposed to be able to do is a sort of another subdivision, which is paleoecology, which is actually reconstructing ecosystems in the rocks. So you dig up your rocks, you dig up your fossils, and you're supposed to be able to work out, well, this was a marine environment because it's got marine fossils in it, or this was a tropical land environment because it's got tropical land plants on it, right? Now, as we go further forward into the presentation, you'll see that there's a bit of a problem with that as we delve into the realms of Noah's flood and fossils and so on and so forth. But the reason why I consider myself in a fairly privileged position, and the Lord has been so good to me over the years, is because, as mentioned, I worked as a zookeeper for 6 years in the animal care industry. So you get a real good hands-on experience with how the living creatures worked. And my work as a zookeeper, also, they ended up funding me to go and do an academic qualification, a diploma in zoology, specifically for zookeepers. So a nice sort of rounded, double-barreled academic background, as well as the various other sort of interesting things that I've gone off and done in the past. But the two main ones are zoology and paleobiology. We love to take people on field trips. As already mentioned, we love to take people to actually go and get hands-on evidence, get hands-on information, get hands-on research, and actually take people out to show them the truth. Plus, we do our own research sort of without the public. You can see here, I'm on the Isle of Wight here. This was a couple of years ago now, and you can see I'm excavating a dinosaur skull there, a back of a dinosaur skull. Some marvelous things that God has actually enabled us to go and find, and allowed us to find and dig up and do some research. We often take cameras around with us as we travel, and we will end up filming our research projects. This is a brand new project which we've only just finished today, so praise the Lord for that. Land of Fire and Ice, dealing with that tricky, controversial subject of climate change. You see, I recently got married a few months back, and we decided to go to Iceland for a honeymoon because it was the only sort of country you could get into at the time without all the COVID restrictions and so on and so forth. My wife thought it was a honeymoon. I ended up having a sneaky agenda to wanting to go there because I wanted to actually document the history of climate. And we had a fantastic time, both on our honeymoon and actually filming and clambering up glaciers and doing some wonderful exploring. But it gives you a very interesting perspective on climate change, and more particularly important, an important biblical view of climate change and how that fits into the world around us. So you can find out more about that project again on creationresearch.net. We also have the museums project. John Mackay has been travelling and entering Europe and the UK for the last 30 odd years. That's 30 odd years of research. That's 30 odd years of fossils in our collections, which we've recently sort of collated together. I myself have been collecting fossils from the age of 6. As we've already mentioned. So we've got a lot of fossils, not just fossils though, but also artifacts, which include things like archaeological artifacts, geological exhibits, natural history, so stuffed animals and so on and so forth, which we're currently trying to get into a museum setup, including fossils like this. This was one of our donations a few years back. Can you see big fish? Can you see little fish? Can you see how little fish is coming out of big fish's mouth? Well, let's delve into this sort of realm of geology, and specifically dealing with fossils and paleobiology, and how does this all relate in a biblical fashion. Let's start by going to one of the perhaps the most famous, or certainly one of the most famous natural history museums in the world, the Natural History Museum of London. Also one of the oldest in the world as well, designed by Sir Richard Owen to look like a cathedral. You can see it standing in all its glory there. It looks very sort of cathedral or church-like. That's because it was sort of based off of a cathedral. It was designed, Sir Richard Owen, who founded it, designed it to be a display place of God's creation, including dinosaurs, which he believed, by the way, were the monsters that God made. However, if you go into these natural history museums today, you don't see Sir Richard Owen very prominently anymore. You see Charles Darwin, and you see lots and lots of fossils. Some spectacularly preserved fossils, some absolutely marvellous fossils from all over the world. And this is what they teach you in these museums. Fossilization, that is turning a creature into a fossil, is a really slow process. You see this in museums all over the world. Fossilization, according to these museums, requires a very slow process. All right, well, let's delve in a little bit deeper then. This is on a museum plaque here, actually. It's sort of been it's taken straight from a museum plaque. We've changed it slightly to get around copyright, but this is what they teach you in these museums. How to get a fossil fish. Step 1, a fish dies and sinks to the bottom of the lake. Step 2, the fish rots and only the bones are left, and so the fish is then covered with mud. Step 3, millions of years pass and the mud turns to rock. Over time, the bone matter is completely changed into mineral matter, and the fish is now a fossil. A simple 3-step plan to actually getting a fish fossil, according to the museum. And the point is, according to the museums, fish fossils are supposed to take millions of years to actually form. Millions of years for that mud to turn to rock. All right, well, let's have a Bible verse. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast to what is good. I love this Bible verse because it could so easily fit in a science textbook. This is what we are supposed to do as scientists. We have an idea, we have an observation, we formulate an opinion about it, and then we go and test it. If it holds up to the evidence, you hang on to it and you use it as a building block to get to the next step. If it doesn't hold up to the evidence, then you throw it out as no good. Of course, the best thing about this Bible verse is that it isn't in a science textbook. It is actually in the Bible. You see, it's a commandment that God has told us as Christians that we ought to be doing this, testing all things, hold fast to what is good. So let's do some testing. Let's take you to the Genesis Museum of Creation Research. That's our museum we're now setting up in Shropshire in the UK. Let's introduce you once again to our fish fossil. Now, I first found out about this fish fossil. There's been a few examples of them around the world. This particular one I found out when I was in a fossil shop down in Charmouth, a very famous shop, with this wonderful fossil on display, locked up behind cabinets. And I said, oh, this is marvellous. Can I take some photographs of it, please, so I can, use it in my presentations? And he said, yes, absolutely. And so as I travelled around and I was using this in my presentations, one of the people at the presentation, a long-time supporter, came up and said, hey, I want to try and raise the funds to buy this fossil for you if it's still available. Now, this was like 6 years down the line from when I first saw the fossil, so I had no idea whether it'd still be there, but I didn't want to discourage him. Like, yeah, absolutely, go for it. And sure enough, a couple of months later, he knocked on the door, and there was the fish fossil, ready for me to have and take and put in our museum. It's a wonderful fossil. You can get some spectacular detail on it, on big fish and on little fish. And you notice what I've put there? Fossil rocks are fast rocks. You see, this is a concept that is really going to sort of, what this evening is really going to center around, is that point that fossil rocks have to be fast rocks. There's no other way to actually get a fossil. What am I talking about? Well, when I first found this fossil and took photographs of it, when I initially began to use it in my presentations, I thought that this was a fossil of a big fish who was halfway through eating his lunch, and he'd been buried so quickly that he hadn't even had time to finish his lunch. That's what I thought. That's what's promoted in many of the creationist museums around the world that have similar exhibits like this, or in books and magazines. But test all things. Let's dig in a little bit closer. Can you see little fish? And you can see where my arrows, my red arrows, are pointing to. Can you see the little indentations of where... hang on a minute. Little fish is not in the process of being eaten. Little fish has already been eaten. You can see the indentations, the teeth marks, from where big fish has munch, gobbled him down. And then something has so suddenly and so violently caught up big fish and squashed him that little fish has gone blop, and it's come out of his mouth. This is a fish which is currently vomiting a recently eaten meal. Fast rocks? Yeah, it's been buried so quickly with such a huge amount of force that it's literally forced the contents out of its stomach. And I don't know if you can see it there. Let's see if I can get a little laser pointer on here. There we go. If I show you down here, this sort of little straight thing here, this is actually another small fish inside. That's part of the backbone. Another small fish which is already inside the creature's mouth. This isn't the only example. This is one of our big displays that we have in Australia in our big collection. You see all the fish there? You see the fish up in the top corner? Let's blow him up a little bit. Can you see big fish? Can you see little fish? Can you see little fish coming out of big fish's mouth? You see, this is exactly the same type of fossil as we have in the UK. The only difference is little fish is a little bit more digested. Hey, this is a fossil fish vomit. Something has caught this fish up so quickly and so suddenly and so violently, it's forced the contents of his stomach out into the surrounding area. Now, if you keep fish, or if you keep any sort of pets or whatever, one thing you know is that vomit doesn't hang around very long, and also neither does like fecal, feces, poo, fish poo. It disintegrates when it comes out. Vomit, when fish vomit, it just disintegrates into the disperses into the sea around it. If you want to actually get something trapped like this, you need to bury that creature, you need to bury that fish mixed into the sediment with such violence and such force that it forces the vomit out, but the vomit can't actually go anywhere. And so you end up having a fossil fish vomiting. All right, let's go back to step one of that 3-step plan. Can you remember what it was according to the museums? How do you get a fossil fish? Step one, the fish dies and sinks to the bottom of the lake. Well, you've got your first problem there, because here's a dead fish. It's not sunk to the bottom in the slightest. It's floating on the top. See, this is because fossil fish, actually have something called a swim bladder, or a air bladder, or most fish do anyway. And you see, when they're swimming along and they die, this swim bladder will bloat, they will fill up with gas, and they will float. Because the swim bladder is actually there to help them with buoyancy. If they fill it up, they begin to float. If they let it out, they sink. Perfect if you're alive. If you're dead, you don't have any, control over it or power over it. So most fish, when they die, will bloat, they'll float, and then very, very quickly, they will actually become destroyed. Away, nothing left. hey, if you buried that fish in that state on the screen now, would you get a beautifully preserved fossil with all the fins and everything, just like our fossil fish in the UK? No, you wouldn't. If you want to fossilize a fish with that level of detail, you need to bury it very quickly indeed. Okay, once again, a reminder, test all things, hold fast to what is good. Because you see, as we went around, we started getting some critiques. I've been using this argument for a long time, right? And I started getting some critiques. The critiques were that under some conditions, fish can sink and stay on the sea floor. Okay, and I looked it up, and they're right. Under some conditions, fish can sink and stay on the sea floor. And they do this for two reasons. The first one is some fish don't actually have a swim bladder. Sharks are a classic example of this. Sharks just sink to the bottom of the floor when they die. Also, in some conditions, if the water is very, very cold, the swim bladder or the air bladder actually contracts. It doesn't bloat at all. It contracts, it goes the opposite, and the fish will sink. Of course, the critiques went on to say, if fish can sink and stay on the sea floor, therefore the fish that sink to the floor can become fossilized. Therefore, you can get fish fossils without a flood and or catastrophic burial. That was the argument that was used. All right, remember, test all things, hold fast to that which is good. Fish can sink to the sea floor under some conditions, but you still have to get past one final hurdle. Let me introduce you to a small fungus. This is a fungus. You see the fish eggs there? It's common in aquariums. These are fish eggs that it's eating. You see, I once was given this presentation and I was talking through this problem, and I had a guy come up to me afterwards and said, you know what, you're absolutely right, but this may help you. I'm actually a fish farmer. I farm fish for commercially, you know, for eating. And he said, whenever we have a fish die, there is a race against time to get that fish out of it, out of the tank, before it actually begins to rot. He said, and this is the reason why. When my fish die, they're in cold water tanks, so they start to sink. They will sink and settle on the sea floor, on the tank floor. And then, no matter what we try and pump into the tank, it doesn't seem to kill it. This fungus will come up, will actually anchor itself onto the fish, so it will attach the fish to the sea floor, anchored it in place, and then within a matter of hours, it will actually destroy that fish beyond recognition. And we have to get into the tank and get rid of that rotting fish before it contaminates the rest of the tank. And we do a bit of research, remember testing all things, do a little bit of digging, and you find that this fish is actually found all throughout the world, or this fungus rather, sorry, is found all throughout the world in various different forms, whether it's in freshwater streams, saltwater streams, or elsewhere. You see, this fungus destroys the fish very, very quickly. The point? Would you get a fish fossil slowly, even if the fish sank to the bottom of the sea and stayed there? Answer? Absolutely not. The fish would be destroyed long before it could be fossilized. You see, if you want to make a fossil fish, you actually need to have three things in place. You need it to be buried extremely quickly, you need it to be buried very deeply, and you need it to be buried without the presence of oxygen. If you do not have those three things, you will never get a fossil. Our point, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with the process. Get the process right, you get a quick fossil. Get the process wrong, it's not just a case of get the process wrong, it takes millions of years to make a fossil, because if you get the process wrong and you add time into the equation, then time is going to destroy your creature long before you have a chance to actually turn it into a fossil. Nothing to do with time, everything to do with a process. You can find out more about our fossils in Tights, Mites and Fossil Fights. I co-authored this book with John Mackay. You may well have mentioned it. If you go to creationresearch.net and click on shop, we've got shops in the USA, in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, so you can actually buy this fossil book, as well as many other evidences to show that the Earth is young. You can also find out more about our museums project. We're just in the process. You can see Creation Research Centre. Yes, I'm sorry to our USA listeners in. We spell centre slightly differently over here in the UK. So creationresearchcentre.com. We are going to start a project where we are putting up, hopefully 1 or 2 a day, a new artifact, a new fossil, a new exhibit onto our website. The website's still under construction at the moment, but we're going to try and get a new thing on there every day so you can start to see our catalogue of absolutely marvellous fossils and artifacts and things that God has enabled us to be able to get over the years. You can find out more about the UK ministry at creationresearch.net or creationresearchuk.com. You can also find out about some fabulous fossil books for kids, like What Happened to the Dinosaurs, Tides, Mites and Fossil Fights, Your Questions About Creation Answered, Who Made All the Dinosaurs? Stuff for adults and kids alike, which really delves into that question of how do we know that the Bible is true from the very beginning? Here's another example, because we're dealing with fossils here. We're also dealing with Noah's flood. And what has that got to do with paleobiology? What has that got to do with fossils? Well, this is the UK. You can see Scotland at the top, England down the bottom, Wales is over to the right, and the little island, Wales is over to the left, sorry. And you can see the little island to the left as well is Ireland. Let's take you a little bit closer, because I'm going to introduce you to a research project of mine, which has basically been a lifelong obsession with this place. This is Hunstanton. Hunstanton is, well, let me show you exactly where it is. There's the UK again. England is the highlighted place. Over in the little red patch is Norfolk. That's where I originally hail from. Let's take you into Norfolk. There's, over there is West Norfolk. There's West Norfolk blown up, and Hunstanton is just about there. I mean, England isn't the biggest of countries in the world, and Hunstanton is just a tiny little portion of that country. What I'm going to try and do is explain to you a bit about fossils and the flood with Hunstanton, and then match it up to the world, so you can get a bigger perspective. All right, Hunstanton. What's so fascinating about it? Well, let's get behind the geology. You can see it's got some wonderful different colours there, 3 different colours. At the bottom you have the carstone, that sort of mottled brown rock there. It's a sandstone. In the middle you have the wonderful striking red Hunstanton formation. That's a chalk, a red chalk. And at the top you have the Ferriby chalk formation, which is your bog standard white chalk, right? The Hunstanton formation and the Ferriby formation are full of fossils. Okay, let's get in a bit deeper. What are the supposed dates? Well, according to secular evolution, the carstone at the bottom is 109 million years. The Ferriby chalk formation at the top is 99 million years, and the red chalk in between the two of them is 101 million years, supposedly. Okay. Remember our Bible verse earlier from 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast to what is good. Let's actually do some testing on Hunstanton here, because you can actually take this principle, even though Hunstanton is a tiny, tiny little segment of the world, you can take this principle and apply it just about anywhere. We are actually going to test those dates. Well, you find lots of fossils inside Hunstanton. You can see this wonderful fossil we dug up a few years back now. You see the curly-whirly ammonite in the middle picture, the big curly-whirly fossil, and sitting on top of that curly-whirly ammonite is a shark's tooth pressed into the ammonite. And then to the right-hand side of the ammonite, you can see a sea urchin. You can also see I've labelled the strata. Strata is layers, by the way. It's a technical geologist's term. You see the layers. Can you see how the sea urchin is actually sitting up through the layers? It's not sitting flat on the bottom at all. Now, this is very important as we delve into this, so bear that in mind. There's the sea urchin there. It's sitting up sideways. It's on its side. It's not lying flat. You see, one thing that, remember what my thing was, I was supposed to study paleobiology? Paleobiology is the study of living things in the fossil record, or certainly matching them up to ecosystems. Now, paleobiology teaches that creatures live, creatures die, and creatures get buried in the same place. Well, this isn't buried how it was living. It's been turned on its side. And you see the little green thing I've put on the top there? That's a modern day sea urchin that I picked up on the beach. Hasn't changed one bit, as opposed 99 million years old, and it's still a sea urchin. So it hasn't changed in that 99 million years. In fact, it's been doing exactly what God told it to do, which is reproduce after its own kind. Of course, that begs the question, if it's gone for 99 million years without changing one bit, why does it have to be 99 million years old? Interesting. Let's delve a bit deeper. Introduce you to another fossil, this time from the red chalk, that Hunstanton formation. This is a brachiopod, by the way. It's about 2 inches tall for our American viewers. For UK, that's about 5 centimeters tall. That's what it looks like today. There's a living example on the right-hand side there, and on the left-hand side you can see a diagram which shows you how this is supposed to sit up in the real world. You can actually look, if we go back a little bit, can you see, I'll get my laser pointer out, 1 second, if I can find my mouse, there we are. You see this little sort of hole at the top here? They all have this. This is where a little tube attaches. There's the tube just down there. You can see it attaches it to the bottom of the sea floor. That's this bit over here. And it sits upright and it can open and shut the 2 halves of the shell. Now, this way that we had this brachiopod laid out is exactly how we find them in the rocks. In other words, they didn't live there and die there and get buried there, because this brachiopod is actually turned upside down on its back. Interesting what you can actually find when you dig these fossils up. They're all like this, by the way. There's a brachiopod, and there's another one. Can you see how it's sitting up through the rock? Can you see how the layers, there's the layers over here, and how it's sitting up through the layers? Interesting. All right, let's go back to the dates. 109 million years supposedly at the bottom, 99 million years at the top. How would you challenge this? Well, 109 minus 99 equals 10 million years. In other words, according to those dates, it took 10 million years to form, to lay down, to deposit Hunstanton cliffs, right? 10 million years to lay down Hunstanton cliffs, if the dates are accurate. If the dates are correct, it took 10 million years to create these. So how tall are they? Well, the cliffs there are about 20 meters or 65 feet. All right, well, I'm going to do a math equation now, and I apologize to our American friends. We're going to use metric for it because it's a lot easier to get your head around it. 109 million years at the bottom, 99 million years at the top. That means that it took 10 million years to lay down 20 meters of sediment if the dates are correct. So how do we test them? Well, it's simple. You take 20,000 millimeters, which, by the way, is the same as 20 meters. 20 meters is 20,000 millimeters. So it took 10 million years to lay down 20,000 millimeters. So you simply divide the height of the cliff by the time that it supposedly took to form it, according to the dates, and you get 0.0002 millimeters per year, or 0.00007 inches per year. I mean, that's a tiny amount. Can you put your fingers that close together? No. Okay, ask yourself this question then. If these dates are accurate, that means that it took 14,285 years to deposit 1 inch of sediment, or 28,000 years to bury the brachiopod. Let me ask you another question. There's the brachiopod there. It would have taken about, well, in excess of 28 million years to actually just bury that brachiopod, let alone fossilize it. Would you ever get a fossil if it really took that length of time? No, you wouldn't, not in the slightest. That fossil, that creature would be destroyed long before. I mean, 28,000 years? That's a ridiculous length of time just to bury the brachiopod. And the beauty of this equation is that all we've done, we've put 2 things in, 2 pieces of data. One of them is an absolute piece of data, that's the height of the cliffs. The other one is a, you could call, theoretical piece of data. It's the supposed ages that it took, the supposed time that it took to lay these cliffs down. And you get a ludicrous result. The point, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with a process. if you want to fossilize these things, you need to bury them very, very quickly. Of course, again, you get lots of critiques as you go around. You see, chalk is a limestone. Limestone is supposed to deposit in shallow marine environments. It's supposed to take a very long time to form. And the critique was, well, deposition would not actually be constant when it was. You see, what we've done, we've taken the date at the bottom, the date at the top, we've worked out how long it supposedly took to form according to the date and divided it to get an equal measurement. And the argument is, well, that doesn't actually work because deposition may have sped up, it may have slowed down, it could be all over the place. Well, it's a valid critique, but it doesn't actually work. You see, what you then have to do is say, well, what does the evidence indicate about deposition? What does the evidence from the fossils actually show us about how these fossils actually formed? Delve in a bit deeper, you find that Hunstanton has got a whole wealth of evidence. Fossils there were buried rapidly, there's no doubt about it. Just the simple presence of a fossil there shows that it was buried very rapidly. You find these rapid fossils buried all throughout the deposits. So the next question is, do you find evidence of currents and flow? Again, remember what I was taught in university as a paleobiologist. You're supposed to dig up fossils and reconstruct an ecosystem. The idea is that the creatures lived, died, and were buried in the same environment. So what evidence is there? Is there any evidence that these creatures did not live, die, and bury there? Is there any evidence that these creatures were swept into position? Well, yes, there is. I wrote this paper a few years back now in 2017 entitled the Evidence of Transportation and Rapid Burial in the Fossils of Hunstanton. It was a 3-month research project into Hunstanton, specifically looking for evidence of transportation. Transportation in fossil terms means evidence of fast-flowing currents which moved the fossils into position with a slurry of sediment and buried them in a transported state, as opposed to living, dying, and being buried in the same location. We looked for evidence of transportation during both the formation of the Hunstanton and Ferriby formations, as well as while those fossils were being buried. What did we find? 93% of fossils showed transportation. I mean, I used the example earlier of the brachiopod that was sitting upright in the layers. That's evidence of transportation. It didn't live and die and bury there. It was whipped up, turned upside down, and buried like that. Evidence of transportation. Belemnites, the sort of elongated bullet-shaped creatures, all pointing in the same direction. That's evidence of transportation. Fast-flowing water. Therefore, when these fossils were formed in water, when these fossils were formed, the water was flowing in one direction. These fossils were being caught up in a slurry of sediment before being buried very rapidly and then fossilized. You see, we actually have documented a lot about Hunstanton and a lot about the work that we do in the Rocks Cry Out project. You can see our team there. We travel around the UK filming documentaries, filming short little pieces of evidence about these locations and putting them up for free on our Creation Research YouTube channel that you can actually watch, so you can get to grips with some of the geology. And just like Hunstanton, which is a tiny little segment of the Earth's, the Earth's surface, you can take that process, that principle behind it, and actually bring it forward to find evidence and use that evidence around the world. So you can also buy the books online, which goes into a lot more detail, including our famous Jurassic Coast about Mary Anning. Hunstanton goes a lot more into detail about these fossils, that you can actually find evidence for them in the rocks, including that research paper which I published. And we've got a special deal on Creation Research Store at the moment, so do check that out. But let's start to sort of wrap this all together as we sort of finish this. Let's wrap it all together and give you that evidence of a worldwide flood, because Hunstanton is a tiny little location, so let's use those same principles but put it on a much bigger scale. Let's take you to Cheddar Gorge in the UK. I love Cheddar Gorge. It's sort of our equivalent in the UK, or the closest thing in the UK we have to the Grand Canyon. It is pretty marvellous. Cheddar Gorge is, it's a lot smaller though, by the way. It's a wonderful place. Lots of great fossils, lots of great limestone. Limestone similar to chalk. This is actually Carboniferous limestone. Don't get hung up on the names, by the way. Carboniferous literally means it's full of carbon. This is where coal comes from. Oh, again, I have to remember we have people all around the world viewing this, so let me give it its American name. You see, most of the original geologists were British, and of course the British geologists gave them their own name, and the Americans couldn't possibly use the British names for it. So rather than Carboniferous, they named them Pennsylvanian and Mississippian rocks. Pennsylvanian rocks, the rocks that were first studied by the Americans in Pennsylvania. Mississippian, ones that were studied in Mississippi. You see, names, these big, long, complicated technical names, they have nothing to do with millions of years in evolution, but everything to do with where they were first studied or what they're actually made up of. So let's take you to Cheddar Gorge. Let's dig up some fossils. Let's see what we can find. You see all those little white flecks that you see on the rock behind me? They're all fossils. Fossils like this. A brachiopod. Just like the brachiopods in Hunstanton. Wonderful fossils, by the way. Marvellous brachiopod shells. Great stuff that you can find all throughout Cheddar Gorge. Well, there's a brachiopod shell there. Keep a good look at it because it's important to remember, because what you actually find is all these brachiopod shells are all buried together, buried in water. They're marine. They've all been washed together, which equals a flood. You see, limestone is a water-based sediment, so it was buried in a flood. It was buried by water. Well, let's take you to Australia, Georgia's home country, and you can see this is a plaque at a very famous set of caves in New South Wales. It says this plaque celebrates the sister cave relationship between Cheddar Show Caves and Jenolan Caves, New South Wales, Australia. You see, Cheddar Gorge has many caves running through them, Cheddar, Goff's Cave and all sorts of marvellous stuff, and it's actually twinned with Jenolan Caves. Okay, let's have a little dig around Jenolan Caves then, in Australia. It's sort of located around the Blue Mountains in Australia. I visited here a few years back. There's another much, much bigger canyon than Cheddar Gorge, and there's the caves behind me. I visited here in 2018 during a creation research trip to Australia. Guess what rock it is? Carboniferous limestone. The same Carboniferous limestone that you find over in England. In fact, you find it all the way through Europe and Asia, running down to Australia. It's the same limestone. It's the same deposit. It's the same rock formation. Because look, there's the brachiopod shells. Same shells, same formation, same rock, same layers. Hey, this formation is nearly 16,000 kilometers across. That is a really big flood. Okay, well, let's use another example. Carthage in Tennessee, a USA example. Can you see the rock layers there in the sort of roadside cut through? What is this rock type? This is Ordovician limestone. Ordovician, okay, it's a different type of rock. It's a very similar rock, but it's a slightly different type of rock to the Carboniferous limestone. This is Ordovician limestone. Ordovician, well, in Wales, in the United Kingdom, where we're split into 4 countries. Over in the west, there's Wales. In Wales, there used to live a lot of Celtic tribes many, many years ago, before the Romans invaded. Celtic tribes. These Celtic tribes, one of which were named the Ordovici. By the way, this tribe is now extinct. It no longer is alive, this tribe of people. When the geologists first started digging up fossils in South Wales, they actually came across some other extinct creatures. So they decided to name the rocks that these extinct creatures came from, called trilobites, after the tribe of extinct people that used to live there, the Celtic people, and they named them the Ordovician rocks after the Ordovici tribe. Ordovician limestone from Carthage in the USA. This Ordovician limestone, by the way, is found all throughout the USA. And guess what's in it? Fossils! Brachiopod shells. Brachiopod fossils. Interesting. More brachiopod fossils. And a wonderful crinoid fossil mess. Look at all those fossils crammed together. By the way, a big fossil mess equals a flood. where currents have come through and ripped it up and tossed it about and dumped it down in a slurry of rock sediment. The point, it's got nothing to do with time, everything to do with the process. But I've said that before. All right, well, let's go back to the UK and make that same match that we did for Cheddar Gorge and Jenolan Caves. This is the Lake District. Very beautiful place, very famous place. Hey, look, it's Ordovician limestone. The same Ordovician limestone that was in the USA, in Carthage. Go inside some of our caves, wonderful waterfalls in there, wonderful limestone formations there as well. And guess what? Brachiopod shells. The same brachiopod shells that were in Carthage in Tennessee and are found all throughout the USA. Brecon Beacons in Wales. Guess what? Ordovician limestone with trilobites in it. They're the trilobites that had to do with the story of how the Ordovician rocks were named Ordovician. And there's another trilobite fossil from Carthage in the USA. Hey, this one is 6,460 kilometers apart, or 4,000 miles apart. That's a really big flood. But guess what? That is a really, really big flood. The same type of formation, the same water-based sediment, the same fossils, the same flood deposit covering most of the Earth's surface. Hey, that's a really big flood deposit. You see, the evidence is there when you actually look. You just need to know what to look for. And again, it's got nothing to do with time, everything to do with the process. So what can we actually find out from these rocks? The stuff that's in Carthage, Tennessee, the White Cliffs of Dover, the Ordovician limestone, all this stuff that you find, the limestone formations around the world. Well, there's one important thing, and it really goes to show the not time but process point. Inside all of these caves, both in the USA, in Jenolan Caves, in Cheddar Gorge, you see these wonderful stalactite and stalagmite formations. Again, supposedly take hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years to form, because it's apparently such a slow process. Okay, test all things, hold fast to what is good, let's do some testing, let's actually find out how long it really takes to make these stalactites and stalagmites. So let's take you to my local village. This is the next village along from where I live in Shropshire. Chirk is just inside Wales, and it has a canal tunnel in it. You know the old English canals? All right, well, let's take you inside. What's growing from the ceiling? Stalactites and stalagmites. Well, this tunnel is just a couple of 100 years old, yet there's stalactites growing from it. There's fabulous formations all down the sides of it. You can actually match them up with real ones in caves. Exactly the same, no difference in the slightest. Marvellous veils of this, they're called splenotherms, or, stalactites or stalagmites. Beautiful stuff inside a very young canal tunnel. Okay, get up nice and close. Can you see the beautiful stalactite? You can catch the dripping water from it. You see, we've had critiques to say that these stalactites growing inside the tunnel aren't the same as the ones in caves because their pH measurement is different. How alkaline or how acidic something is. Well, you can test it. They match up exactly the same with caves. It's exactly the same, no difference at all. Hey, this happened in just a few hundred years inside Chirk Canal Tunnel. It doesn't take millions of years in the slightest. Hey, you can actually find this evidence all around the world, and it makes the point that it doesn't take millions of years to actually form these. It's got everything to do with a process. You can actually watch our documentary of Chirk Canal Tunnel for free on the rockscryout.co.uk or our Creation Research YouTube channel. I recommend you go and find out it and explore and find some evidence. There's so much that we could cover in just this short little segment that we're never going to get through it all. So do find out more on creationresearch.net or creationresearchcenter.com and actually find the truth and the true story of the world in light of the Bible. My final point, again, if you want to make a fossil, if you want to make a worldwide deposit, if you want to make any rock formation at all, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with the process. Time is your biggest enemy when it comes to this kind of stuff. Well, that's the end of my slideshow, so I'm going to stop sharing and see if we can come back onto the presentation.
Yes, I got to say, Indiana Joe, that was an amazing presentation, and I could probably speak for George when I say this, I'm already excited to watch it again to take more notes because the chat was very lively. We got a ton of good comments, questions.
Marvelous.
It really reminds me, Joe, of 2 Peter 3, where the scoffers are willingly ignorant of all this undeniable and overwhelming is essentially evidence, that points to the global flood. The world that then was being overflowed with water perished. So, and also one thing I kept thinking is your presentation was so detailed and informative that you answered and essentially refuted many of the best critics' arguments and questions anyways. I mean, you touched on so many good topics. So I wanted to make those comments before we got into any specific questions. Great presentation, Joe.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Okay, here we are. Screen
Okay,
looks
my
good.
topic is Noah's flood. Actually, an issue I've been working on for 45 years with research, besides the Ice Age. Anyway, this title is Astounding Evidence for Noah's Flood. What I'm going to give you is just a summary and just the highlights of the summary of all the details you can fit into the what can be called as the flood model. But there's a lot of secular researchers and even some Christian geology professors who say there isn't any evidence for the flood. Here's one from Davis Young, retired professor of geology from Calvin College, in a book titled, of all things, The Biblical Flood. He says, there is no geological evidence to confirm the idea of a universal deluge. Boy, isn't that an amazing thing? And I'm going to go back to that towards the end and kind of have a suggestion of why. I'm going to talk for maybe about 45 minutes, an hour, and I'm going to open it up to questions and go from there. Anyway, when I hear challenges like that, and by the way, I try to keep up with 50 earth science journals in the local library here at Montana State University. And I run into challenges all the time in the earth science, but I see them as just research opportunities. But when I look at these secular articles, I glean the raw observational data from their interpretations and I separate them. I'm looking for the real raw data. That's the science that I'm looking for. And I go from there. Anyway, this is my theme verse for research. It's a good theme verse for all of life. Examine everything carefully, hold fast to that which is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, New American Standard Version. I can't emphasize carefully enough, because if you examine an issue just superficially, you might know enough just to get into trouble. You got to go carefully, dig. So I dig into the research, and then that's how from there I write my articles and books. So anyway, I want to start with this graph. When we're talking about the flood, I want to first of all say a little bit about what was the pre-flood world like before the flood. And we have some clues, not only from the Bible, but from geology and the fossils. One big clue is that the estimated amount of coal in the earth is about 10 times the amount of carbon than in the current biosphere, meaning that we probably had about 10 times as many plants and trees on the pre-flood earth. And there's hardly any frost rings, if any. So it's a warm climate with a huge amount of vegetation before the flood. And the interesting thing about vegetation is it gives off water vapor, transpiration. 10% of the rain we get on the continents is from transpiration through the leaves of trees. And so they'd add a lot of water vapor to the pre-flood earth so we can from that, we know we're going to have a pretty good greenhouse effect, and we need to water all that. So we had a different hydrology. There's a question whether it rained before the flood. I kind of lean that it did, even though it's uncertain from the Bible. And I must say that we don't know what the geography was before the flood and the topography. They were both much different. So we don't know those things. One thing from my field, it doesn't look like there's a vapor canopy, as some people thought in the early days of creation research, due to the research of Larry Vardaman. It'd be too hot on the surface of the earth. It's plain and simple. And so that's a big problem. I haven't given up on it. You might be able to tweak it with a three-dimensional computer model with clouds and so forth, but my hope isn't up. Anyway, I don't do anything more than that. But we had the pre-flood Earth. We have some clues from the fossils and the amount of coal. Okay, when we look at just the Bible, we can kind of diagram the flood. Like any flood, there's a rising stage called the flooding stage and a retreating stage. And all floods are like this. So if we use that, we can realize that it appears that, even though there's controversy over it, the flood peaked at day 150. That's generally the most common view, and I subscribe to it. And so during the flooding stage, we can divide it up into two phases. And each phase that you see at the top up here on my screen produces different signatures in the rocks. And so the first phase, by the way, this comes from Dr. Taz Walker from Creation Ministries International in Australia, who first reported on this in 1994 at the International Conference on Creationism, and I subscribe to it wholeheartedly. And based on this template, I've been able to see things from this point of view and see just a tremendous amount of evidence for the flood, which I'll just be summarizing for you. So two phases. The first phase is probably the most violent, when the mechanism of the flood erupts. And the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven opened, and the result of these were rain for 40 days and 40 nights. So that first phase probably was 40 days, and then it lessened and the rain lessened. And so we went into phase two, which is a general rise. In phase one, it was probably a rapid rise, lots of turbulence, fast currents. I'm not going to talk much about the mechanism. I lean towards a particular mechanism, but there's several models of flood mechanisms out there. But this is kind of doesn't depend on any one particular flood mechanism. This is just a diagram from the Bible. We should look at the rocks from the point of view of the Bible. That's the beauty about what Taz Walker does, not from assuming the geological column, for instance. And a lot of times they line up anyway, but sometimes they don't. Anyway, the first, I think Taz Walker calls it the eruptive phase. So it's about 40 days, I think, and then it tailed off, and you had a gradual rise of the floodwaters. Phase two, called the ascending phase in Taz Walker's terminology. Now, during that ascending phase, you had a lot of oscillating currents due to tides and about 4 other mechanisms I can think of, and a gradual rise. So we had gradual sedimentation with cyclical sedimentation going on, forming coal seams and other cyclical depositional patterns that you see commonly in the rocks. So the flood peaked at day 150. And this was the time when all that breathed air and lived on land died, and all the sediments were deposited, and the fossil and the organisms were in the sediments that turned to rock. pretty quick. Sedimentation is a very interesting, difficult thing I've been working on for the last couple of years for sand, and it's very complicated. But anyway, during the flood, you can cement these sediments pretty fast and fossilize the organisms at the same time. So that's where all the strata fits right in there. And not only all the strata we see on the continents today, on the continents today, we have an average of 1,800 meters of sediment, about 6,000 feet average. But at the peak of the flood, based on the amount of sediments that ran off during the retreating stage, which I'll get to, there was actually about twice as many sediments on the continents as the 1,800 meters we still have left on the average, about 3,600 meters. So we have to develop 3,600 meters of sediments on all the continents average, and just on the continents, which is not on the ocean basins, which is very interesting, but they're making me think about a lot of things to add to this flood model in the future. So at the peak of the flood, Psalm 104, verse 8 says, the mountains rose, the valley sank down. So you had differential vertical tectonics starting at phase 3, the peak of the flood. And when that happens, the floodwater is running off, the retreating stage. The continents are coming up, the ocean basins are sinking. And during phase 4, the currents are very wide. There's hardly anything exposed. Nothing's exposed except, nothing exposed at the peak of the flood. Then finally more mountains and plateaus were exposed with time. But for a while, nothing was there. And so you had big, wide currents moving at high speed from off the continents, just eroding a huge amount of sediment. And there's evidence for this all over. I can show you big chunks of where sediment's been eroded off. I've done a lot of erosion studies on the continents, and I get huge numbers of erosion in many places. Southeast England, for instance, Southwest Africa, the Colorado Plateau, the Appalachian Mountains. I get huge numbers. And from a new paper in the journal called G-Cubed, which stands for Geochemistry, Geophysics, Geosystems, it's a journal of the Geophysical Union. And they know now how much sediments ran off that are in the ocean basin, especially along the edges of the continents, where you'd expect the deposition from all the continental erosion to end up. So, and that's where I get now that there's probably 1,800 meters were eroded off the continents on the average. Remember, we're talking about the average. So you had what's called, phase 4 is sheet erosion, and certain features affected the surface of the earth during that. And from the field of geomorphology, the study of the surface features of the earth and landforms, we can see these features, what happened during what's called the sheet flow phase. Sheet flow means big, wide currents and not very deep, kind of the consistency of a sheet. Like a current might be 2,000 kilometers wide and 10 kilometers deep. So it's very wide and not very deep. It's like a sheet. So you had sheet flow eroding as a sheet, the sediments, and depositing them as a sheet along the continental margins that are now the continental shelf and slope. And then as more mountains and valleys show up above the floodwaters are forced to channelize, go around these, and they mark the surface of the land with different landforms due to channelized erosion during phase 5. And I'm going to show you examples of all these phases from now on. Anyway, these are slides from a talk I normally give, but I'm skipping number 1. This is evidence from strata, which is geological jargon for sedimentary rocks. So a good place to see strata is Grand Canyon, mile deep cut in the earth. And you see the strata. It's about a mile deep, or 5,000 meters deep. And you see, notice several things here. You see these what they call formations, rocks that are similar, and you can trace them for mostly across the 200 and some odd miles of the canyon. Like there's a bottom layer here called the Tapete sandstone. I'm going to make a point of that coming up. And so you have these layers, and we can trace these layers at other locations in North America. Also, we see one layer, one on top of another, with little or no erosion between them. Yet the secular scientists say that this deposition here in Grand Canyon, from the bottom to the top, represents 250 million years. Okay, I'm going to get back to that. Another thing you see at Grand Canyon is that flat surface up there. Wow, you can be going along hiking in a flat surface and all of a sudden see this huge chasm. It's quite breathtaking. And if you've never been there, you should visit it. Anyway, this flat surface is a planation surface, which I'll talk about when I get into the section on geomorphology, on the runoff. Now, that surface represents the erosion of about 3,500 meters of strata as a sheet taken off the whole Grand Canyon area. We know that's because we see the strata in Utah to the north, about 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers to the north, where it's dipping down to the north, and a series of steps called the Grand Staircase. And all that strata used to be up over the Grand Canyon area, about 3,500 meters, and it's been eroded off the whole area, forming a planation surface after it's eroded. So I'm going to talk more about that later. But anyway, here's the Tapete sandstone. It's a very unique sandstone, and it has a unique position. It's on top of the granitic and metamorphic crust, upper crust of the earth, of the continents. So it's a unique location. It's a unique sandstone. It's coarse grained. You can see some of the coarse particles in it. And sometimes you might call it a conglomerate. There's so many quartz grains in it. Small cross beds. It's about 80 meters thick on the average. It varies some. But anyway, we can trace the same sandstone over half of North America, believe it or not. Up in my area, about 150 kilometers north of Grand Canyon in Montana and Wyoming, we see the same sandstone, but it's given a different name because the researchers didn't know they were connected. So up in my area, it's called the Flathead Sandstone, and it sits on top of granite of the upper crust. And here it is right here at Cody, Wyoming. Same coarse grained sandstone, and on top of granite of the upper crust. And when you trace it all out, this is where you find it. Most of it's below the ground in the Midwest and towards the Appalachian Basin. And it occurs up in Canada through the Rockies and up into Northeast Canada, up in the Queen Elizabeth Islands. So it covers about half of North America. Now I want to ask you and it's generally about the same thickness too, 80 meters about. Doesn't deviate a whole lot from that, but it does deviate some. I ask you, if we assume that all this sedimentary rocks was deposited by slow processes over millions of years, which is the secular uniformitarian idea, how are they going to deposit a sand on top of the upper crust of the earth over half of North America? That makes no sense, because deposition today is sand and it changes to clay, mud, gravel in short distances, both horizontally and vertically. It's a mess. And you wouldn't have something like this, not at all. This totally defies secular uniformitarian geology. This is exactly what you expect in Noah's flood, where we had layers laid down over huge areas, one on top of another. And so we're going to get back to the lack of erosion and the layers in here. 5,000 feet, or about 2,000 meters or so, something like that, 1,700 of sediments. They say 250 million years. But you know, erosion on a million-year time scale is huge. So huge that all the continents can be eroded to sea level in only 10 million years at today's rate. But there's some caveats on that, because man has caused some of this erosion, so you got to deal with that. And as the mountains decrease in height, the erosion rate decreases too. But it does not include coastal erosion, which is generally about 7 meters a year along the Arctic coast. But you can put a maximum on this of 50 million years to wipe out the continents to sea level. If erosion is that fast, then where's all the evidence of canyons and valleys in the walls of Grand Canyon? They're not there, indicating that one layer is laid rapidly, one on top of another, with no millions of years involved at all. So here's a little schematic of the Grand Canyon. Let's say this is just for a million years. And here we have the bedrock of the upper crust, and we have 4 layers deposited over the whole Grand Canyon area, 200 and some odd miles. Then we'll give it, say, 100,000 years of time, and this is what would happen. You erode valleys and ridges. And then suddenly it will say it dropped below the sea, and you had more layers deposited. It'd fill up the valleys like this with more layers. And then you do it for another 100,000 years exposure, and more valleys are cut, and so forth and so on. This is sort of what you see. If it's just a million years, or maybe just 100,000 years, you should see huge amount of valleys and canyons in the walls of the Grand Canyon, especially since the uniformitarians claim that these layers, these formations, are a lot of times terrestrial formations or shallow marine formations. Usually that, and in those environments, you'd expect a lot of canyons and valleys to be cut. But this is normally what we see in the Grand Canyon, generally layers that don't change thickness all the way across, but some layers will change thickness a little, pinch out, few pinch out, and that defies secular science. And we see this pattern everywhere where we see sedimentary rocks. We see layers. The deformation or the breaking up of those sedimentary rocks occurred after they were all laid down. Then you had faulting and erosion of them, but they're laid down generally without little deformation at the start. And up in the Grand Teton Mountains of Wyoming, I got a book where 3 geologists admitted this. So here's a sequence of sedimentary rocks right in here, one layer on top of another. That's the top of Grand Teton Mountain, which is granitic or gneiss that's been bowed up, but on the north and south edges, the sedimentary rocks were not washed off. And here's a thickness of about 3,000 feet, or about 900 meters. That is almost the same as in the Grand Canyon, 1,000 kilometers to the south, same sedimentary rocks up here. And there's one layer right after another. This represents maybe about 190 million years in the secular time scale. Anyway, these 3 geologists in this book, The Chronicles of Jackson Hole and the Teton Range, said the regularity and parallelism of the layers in well-exposed sections that I just showed you a picture of suggests that all these rocks were deposited in what? A single uninterrupted sequence. Yes, that's what they say. That's what you look like. That's what we observe. Do they believe it? No. You say, however, the fossils and regional distributions of the rock units show that this is not really the case. They go to their theories of deep time, the millions of years, stretch out everything. The incomplete nature of the stratigraphic record becomes apparent when the spans of time represented by each of the various formations are plotted on the numerical time scale. And this is their time scale. Most of it's missing time. The blue is the time for the formations. And here's the formation names up here. Here's 80 million years missing. Here's their time scale right here, 500 million up to 300 there. And I might add that when you look at these individual formations, it looks like maybe this one was deposited in 10 million years, but you find out that even these formations are full of gaps of time. So you should see little white areas all through these formations, so that when you add it all up, and secular scientists admitted that, they only have 1% of the record of time, 1% about. The rest, 99%, is totally missing. And the important thing is there's no erosion between these layers over about 180 million years. The Flathead Sandstone being the bottom formation in the Cambrian, on top of the Proterozoic granites and gneiss of the upper crust. So evidence from fossils. Now I might add that when we talk about Grand Canyon, I put the deposition of Grand Canyon and practically all the sedimentary rocks in phase 2. I believe phase 1, when the mechanism was unleashing turbulence and a lot of chaos, but not everywhere, that you form deep basins. And so the only sedimentation that occurred during phase 1, I believe, was in deep basins, forming your Pre-cambrian sedimentary rocks, which I have come to believe are from the flood. Why? Because up in my area, here in the Northern Rockies of Montana, I'm privileged to be next to one of the biggest Precambrian formations in the world, called the Belt Supergroup. And that Precambrian formation, dated 1.5 billion years according to the secular timescale, is conformable to the Flathead Sandstone right above in numerous places, as if there's no change in sediments. And it's just one big deposition from the Precambrian up into the Cambrian and the Ordovician and all the other rocks that you see on top of it. So that's, to me, pretty good evidence that the Precambrian sedimentary rocks are from the flood. And it's interesting, practically all Precambrian sedimentary rocks are found in what were used to be basins, deep basins, like the Belt Supergroup was deposited in a basin 25 kilometers deep, big hole. I think it's an impact crater, and so do 2 other secular scientists, filled up rapidly with sediments coming from the west off the current Pacific Ocean, I might add. A lot of details can be filled in, and I'm kind of doing this as I go, because there's a lot more research. I'm just giving you a quickie summary. But so this, I think the real sediment that started in the Cambrian, the flat sediments with little deformation, as you saw in the Grand Canyon, they had to be deposited during a calmer period of the flood. And I think it was during the ascending phase, when the chaos of the flood, of the mechanism of the flood, lessened a lot, so that all the churned up sediments, instead of moving in the water column, which is probably very deep, now settled out. And in all those sediments, we have fossils. And, you know, when we look at the details of fossils, they're strongly against uniformitarianism and show the flood. First of all, how to form a fossil? Well, you have to bury it rapidly. So that's one thing. Not only must it be fossilized rapidly before decay sets in. And right now, fossils are hardly ever forming. You can form them in hot springs areas with a lot of silicon dioxide. But even that is rare. There's hardly any fossils being formed up near Yellowstone Park, where I live near, due to all the hot springs and the silica and carbonate in those hot springs. And chemicals must be forced into the bones and shells rapidly. That's a pretty tall order, and that's one of the main reasons why fossilization is extremely rare today. And yet we have billions, if not trillions, of fossils out there. That's why I think Ken Ham's statement really has a lot of wisdom. He says, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Evidence for the flood. It's exactly what we see. And not slow process of deposition. You can't form fossils that way. And we have these monstrous fossil graveyards. Here's a unique fossil graveyard from Venezuela of ammonite fossils. And then up in my area, we have a lot of dinosaur graveyards North of me, about 150 kilometers, is a graveyard of 10,000 duck-billed dinosaurs, all of the same species, I might add, with no babies or young juveniles, all older adults and older juveniles, which is an unusual feature. There's a number of unusual features on that dinosaur bone bed. But there's a number of other bone beds in Alberta and some in Wyoming. There's lots of dinosaurs around here. That's why I've written one children's book on dinosaurs and one layman's book on dinosaurs. And we also have indications of rapid fossilization, fish eating fish in various locations, and an ichthyosaur that was fossilized in the process of giving birth. So these are indications of rapid deposition. But one of the strongest evidence of rapid deposition all over the world are mollusks. 95% of fossils are mollusks, like clams, and that'll include brachiopods and oysters. And anyway, it's interesting. Most mollusk shells, when you find them as fossils, are closed. But when a mollusk dies, the muscles that keep the shell closed detach, and it opens up quickly and it decays, because even the shell is made of partly organic matter. So it doesn't it takes days, maybe weeks, for the shell to open up. The fact that we have so many closed shelled mollusks all over the world indicates rapid deposition globally. And here's a sample from Washington State, where I was raised, Seattle, Washington. And these are clams, brachiopods, and oysters found in just fossils in Washington State. Okay, now we're going to transition to evidence from geomorphology, the study of the surface features of the Earth. There's a whole lot of surface features that defy uniformitarianism. They can't explain them. And let's go back to this diagram. I've talked about mainly, especially phase 2. That's where most of the deposition occurred on the continents, and even twice as much as we see, as I found out. And by the way, this is a recent discovery I made about the amount of sediments that were eroded off. But we're going to transition to the retreating stage. The waters are running off the continents. The continents are rising, the ocean basin's sinking. Just think of the potential energy where you have water pushed up and then water going down. You can have tremendous movement of the currents and causing tremendous erosion, which we infer from a lot of indications in the sedimentary rocks. There's a lot of ways to determine the amount of erosion, and I'm working on one research project that we hope to send out to the Creation Research Society here soon on the sedimentation of sandstones that give you an indication how much pressure of sediments were above that were eroded, to explain the thin section analysis of these sandstones. So the retreating stage. So I'm going to start with phase 4. And I'm not going to talk about all the evidence for the mountains rising, the valleys sinking down. Lots of evidence for that. So that's a whole different subject, but we'll just transform into the landforms, the geomorphology part of it. So phase 4. So here's a block diagram I made quite a long time ago when I didn't know how much sediment eroded off. And here's the peak of the flood at day 150 would be this area up in here. And this represents all the eroded strata, retreating stage erosion. This is the current continental surface with a nice dinosaur fossil there at the top. And this is the current continental sedimentary rocks, 1,800 meters average. So I figured this is maybe 500 meters, even though in a lot of areas I was getting some big numbers. There's a lot of areas that look like they weren't eroded a huge amount. We don't know because there's no erosional remnants or eroded anticlines to determine how much erosion. But there's other ways. We can tell from sandstone and the rank of coal generally too. And Peter Kleber at Great Falls, Montana, and myself are working on this topic. But because of this new paper I discovered a couple of months ago in the scientific literature, this should go up as high as this right here. The amount eroded is the same as that, approximately the same as that left. Not 500 meters, but 1,800 meters were eroded off the continents. Wow. That is huge. And as it eroded, it left on the surface of the continents that we can see today various features of this erosion that the secular scientists cannot explain, even though they've been trying for at least 150 years. So the first one we're talking about is planation surfaces. I showed you that one in the Grand Canyon area. I think I might have another picture of it here, unless I deleted it. I have lots of pictures of planation surfaces. So let's first of all define what a planation surface is. Well, I have to go to an erosion surface. Erosion surface is, in the dictionary of geological terms, a land surface shaped and subdued by the action of erosion, which is really not saying too much, but especially by running water. What they're telling us is that the land surface has been shaped by erosion by running water. Oh, and that's kind of sounding like runoff of the floodwaters. Why do they say running water? Because a lot of these planation surfaces have rounded rocks on the top of them, left over after they rounded the rocks, and as the current slowed, it deposited what the stones that were being used to erode the surface. Rounded rock. I'll show you some pictures of all this. The term erosion surface is generally applied to a level or nearly level surface. Now, erosion surfaces can be kind of rolling, but a planation surface is generally dead flat, almost flat as a pancake. And I'm going to just mainly talk about planation surfaces because they're more so distinct. And here's one in north central Wyoming, in the Bighorn Basin, which is about 200 kilometers north-south and about 100 kilometers east-west. This is the northern part. You can see this sedimentary rocks dipping to the west. That's to the right here. I'm looking south. It used to probably be a area bowed up there and just sheared off, forming a planation surfaces and forming about 15 feet of rounded rocks, which are over here too. It continues over here. But it's been dissected by either late flood channelized erosion and or post-flood river erosion. So it leaves this as a small erosion surface. So up in my area and in adjacent Canada, it's the plains consist of about 4 levels of planation surface in relation to the Rocky Mountains, which are over here to the west. This is the high plains of Alberta, Saskatchewan, northern Montana, part of North Dakota. And it has generally 4 levels. We found out it was a simplification because this level right here, called the Wood Mountain Plateau, is in between the top and the second from the top, this green area. Anyway, this is the Cypress Hills right here. This is a continuation, Swift Current Creek Plateau. I'm going to emphasize mainly the Cypress Hills Plateau because it's the highest one. This west end sticks out 2,500 feet above the river to the north, the South Saskatchewan River, and the river to the south of Milk River. 2,500 feet high above the rivers. And it was probably continuous in here. It's about, here's the scale here, 100 kilometers. It's about 120 kilometers long and probably was continuous before late flood channelized erosion eroded it and or river floods from the Ice Age melting, catastrophic river floods. It's called the Cypress Hills, and it's probably about 20 kilometers wide on the average. Probably was continuous at one time. It's a high planation surface, dissected. Many planation surfaces are dissected. These are all planation surfaces right in here. This is the next level. It's been tremendously dissected into isolated, semi-isolated plateaus called the Flaxville Plateaus. All these plateaus in here, and even the ones lower down in this area, are covered by rounded quartzite rocks. And here's a rose diagram right here from the direction where the quartzite came from. You see directional indicators in the quartzite as well as in the interbedded sandstones. And this one said that the rocks that are found on the top of this Cypress Hills, as well as all these plateaus, came from the west-southwest. Another report said the southwest. Well, if we go down to the southwest, we go down to here. The nearest outcrop where you find bedded quartzite rocks is in central Idaho. And this is acknowledged by secular scientists and Peter Kleberg and I that have studied this extensively. Came from central Idaho. All these quartzite rocks on here came from central Idaho. I'm going to talk about quartzite rocks next after planation surface. So let's take a picture. Here's the Cypress Hills, the northwest part, your Reeser Lake. Here's a central part right here. Here has been dissected by a glacial river because I found huge erratic boulders of continental shield rocks in here, indicating ice age erosion. And here's the eastern part of the Cypress Hills right here, all flat as a pancake. You drive up on it and that's what it looks like, flat as a pancake. And then when you drive to the north edge, here's another planation surface. I'm going to talk about the quartzite rocks driving to the north edge soon. This is that planation surface in the Grand Canyon area. Probably about 300 kilometers east-west and about 200 kilometers north-south, the area where it's eroded as a sheet, forming this planation surface. Here's the north rim of the Grand Canyon. I assume everyone can see my cursor, and the Grand Canyon's between in there. But anyway, that's a planation surface. I'll talk about the quartzite rocks when I get to that session. Anyway, all planation surfaces were once much larger in the flood, but they got re-eroded and faulted different altitudes and broken up so that now we just have remnants of these planation surfaces. Anyway, Lester King said that these planation surfaces, which is evidence of runoff of the floodwater as a sheet flow, phase 4, were once huge on all the continents, exactly what we expect during the flood on all the continents, runoff. He says a planation of extraordinary smoothness developed over enormous areas in all the continents. From it, most of the world's present scenery has been subsequently been carved by renewed erosions. Yeah, after it was formed, it got broken up, eroded into remnants, and partly destroyed, forming mountains. A lot of planation surfaces are at the tops of mountains. Here's a planation surface in north central Montana, flat as a pancake. They even have an airport to the left there that's not in the photo. And what we observe with planation surfaces today, they're being eroded, they're being dissected. Like this one, it's being eroded from a stream coming out of the mountains to the right, the Little Rocky Mountains. That's what we see. Planation surfaces are being destroyed, not being formed today. And here's what we expect based on uniformitarian erosion. It'd be slow over millions of years. So in dipping sedimentary rocks, which are fairly common on the surface of the earth, we have generally hard rocks and soft layers. The hard layers would end up as ridges, and the soft layers would be eroded with some of the erosional material left in the valley, unconsolidated sediment. That's what we should see everywhere if uniformitarianism isn't true. We should see no planation surfaces because they're not forming today, except where a river will come out of its bank and erode tilted rocks and can form a flat surface, but that's only local, very local. So we don't see that this today. Well, actually, we do see a little bit of this, and this can be formed by slow currents. But this is commonly what we see. Both hard and soft rocks sheared off the same, implying a very fast current, leaving rounded cobbles and boulders on the top. That's commonly what we see. So, summary, they're not forming today, they're being destroyed. They're against uniformitarianism, they should not exist, but they're not only common as erosion remnants, we have indication they were once much more extensive on the continents. They're worldwide, difficult, if not impossible, to explain by slow processes over millions of years of erosion, powerful evidence for the global flood. So I'm going to get into the second sheet flow, phase 4 landform. It's not quite a landform, it's more an erosional feature and depositional feature. The quartzite rocks spread hundreds of miles from the source. Now, a quartzite is a metamorphic sandstone. After you form a sandstone, you cement the sand, you have to bury it deeply in big, deep holes, and you have to heat it up to about 500 degrees centigrade. And what happens is, since the sand is mostly quartz, you recrystallize it and it forms a kind of a glassy texture. I think I have some pictures here. If not, I have lots of pictures, but only so many I have here. And then after it's buried, in fact, I don't think it was buried too deep, because I think a lot of these basins that were formed early in the flood, the rocks were hot and the water was very hot. That's probably why you don't find any Pre-cambrian fossils, and I think probably acidic water in a lot of areas too. And as you deposit sand and you buried it fairly deep, not as deep as you think from the geothermal gradient down in the earth, it heated up to 500 degrees and formed quartzite. Then you had this uplift, differential vertical tectonics, where the mountains came up, valleys went down, and you eroded huge parts of this, getting down to the hard quartzite rocks. By the way, quartzite's one of the hardest rocks in the world. Could hardly break it open with a rock hammer. And this is the most resistant rock in the Rocky Mountains. The other rocks are fairly soft, and so in fast turbulent currents they're going to pulverize. But round the quartzite rocks. And here's kind of the big picture: a sheet flow current hitting the northern Rockies of Idaho, western Montana, and eroding and rounding the rocks. They start off large. By the way, they are large. They're sometimes about that far, that much in diameter there. And then as you get further out, they get smaller and smaller. And they do. We found some in North Dakota 2 years ago that were only about that big. I have found them in central Saskatchewan. They're reported in southwest Manitoba, north central North Dakota. And if they came from central Idaho, we're talking about 1,200 kilometers from their source to where we find them out in here. Now what kind of rivers are going to deposit these rocks and spread them out there? No rivers, no uniformitarian river can explain it, especially when the Continental Divide is right here. All this, the source is west of the Continental Divide, and now they're across it and way out. You find trillions of these rounded quartzite rocks all over these areas. And then as the Continental Divide area came up, the current split. And so you have a water flow going through the Pacific Ocean, and one continues towards the Mississippi River Valley. And so the current splits, and it's taking quartzite rocks from the northern Rockies and spreading them clear to the Pacific Ocean. I have found them quite a bit in Puget Sound area. I'm from Seattle, which is right there. I've even found them near Vancouver, British Columbia. And they're supposed to be out here in the ocean, even though we looked for them for a day and couldn't find them, around Willapa Bay, which is one of these little bays here in Washington. They're all along the Columbia Gorge. They're found on tops of the mountains in here. Anyway, there's a lot of sensational aspects. Anyway, here's where the belt supergroup forms right here. It's from the belt supergroup. And that's the source, generally source of the quartzite rocks. And so here's a plot of the quartzite rocks from northern Idaho, southwest Montana, and Wyoming. These big green areas are thick accumulations. These accumulations occurred in a deep crack in the rock and piled up rounded quartzite rocks. And here east and northeast of Jackson, Wyoming, the quartzites are 11,000 feet thick. And yet, the state geologist of Wyoming says 80% of it's been eroded. So it's probably about 20,000 feet thick at one time. And all this area got eroded, spreading them way out in here. And here's the Teton Mountains right here. There are quartzites on the very top of the Teton Mountains, like right here. We took a 3-day hike up here. And here they are. Here's some of the quartzite, rounded quartzites. The northern Tetons are some of the sedimentary rocks that were not eroded off the upper crust. It's the top of it's limestone. But the rounded, and it's angular, and the rounded rocks are quartzites. And the largest one I found is this. Notice how rounded it is from the water of action. Now, how did these rocks get on the top up here? I think it's because they spread first and the mountains came up. So it gives us a timing for some of the mountain ranges in the northern Rockies. And here's another one on top of the Teton Mountains. And it's interesting that these quartzite rocks, no matter where I find them, I find these semicircular cracks on them. Remember, this is one of the hardest rocks in the world. This is called a percussion mark, caused by banging of rock against rock. We can't duplicate this, so it must have been turbulent fast flow going 100 miles an hour, 150 kilometers per hour in very turbulent flow, banging up, but some kind of a water cushion to form these. But anyway, the secular scientists agree it is caused by torrential flow, is the way one person described it. And yet these percussion marks on some rocks by the hundreds. I find them all over with these percussion marks, indicating the tremendous pounding that occurred by all this flow of these resistant rocks. And I might add, percussion marks are not forming today on quartzite rocks. Not forming today. It's against uniformitarianism. But it has powerful, it tells us powerful evidence for the flood. And here's a plot of all the ones in Washington State. I've been to many of these. And I want to focus in on, here's one at the top of the Blue Mountains, north of Burns in Central Oregon. And here's a bunch of them on top of the Wallowa Mountains, up to 8,200 feet above sea level. And they're draped over the tops of these mountains. In fact, they're so thick up there that they used to have a placer gold mine on the top of one of the mountains in the Blue Mountains, where they took the quartzite rock and all the finer debris in between, sent it through a sieve to find the gold. There is a lot of gold. In fact, this hill right here is called Gold Hill because there's a lot of gold that is in with the finer particles in the quartzites. But they had to shut the mine down because it became a wilderness area. Anyway, and oh, by the way, I found them numerous places in the Puget Sound area, even on the San Juan Islands and up here near Chilliwack, British Columbia. And here's pictures. This is 8,200 feet on top of the Wallowa Mountains on a ridge. This is the quartzites right here on the top of this ridge. There's supposed to be one a meter in diameter, but I never found it. It's probably in this snowbank. But this is the largest one I found. The nearest source of quartzites 100 miles to the east across what is now Hell's Canyon, the deepest canyon in North America, even deeper than Grand Canyon, I might add. It's 8,000 feet deep on the Idaho side and 6,000 feet on the Oregon side, and it's about 50 miles long. So you can see some of the finds where the gold is found right in here, but that's the largest. That takes a tremendous current to do that. And look at how rounded and polished it is. And I'm going to the Cypress Hills now. All these planation surfaces and ones I don't show here at lower altitudes are capped by quartzite. And this is the quartzite below this, the gravel of the glacial till, glaciation, out in this blue formation right here. Here's the Cypress Hills. It's capped by 75 feet of rounded rocks cemented together, forming a conglomerate. I'm here on the north edge of the Cypress Hills, looking down at the next planation surface, which is 1,000 feet below me. You can kind of see what it's capped by: rounded rocks on a high plateau, indicating that this plateau probably was very extensive, north and south, east and west, and then it got eroded all around, just leaving the Cypress Hills an erosional remnant. Tremendous action and evidence of the flood, huge catastrophism. Here's a more close-up of those rounded rocks. There you go. You know, I find a lot of them are iron stained, so this must have been a lot of iron in the water, probably hot water, so that the iron would stay in the water, and it coats a lot of these as a patina on these quartzite rocks. And here's some percussion marks that are really big on this quartzite right here. Here's the big picture. You had currents running off the Rocky Mountains. The Rockies were coming up, and it was eroding all the plains area. And it was eroding the plains. It deposited the quartzite rocks. Now, the medium-sized rocks were carried up in the suspension, come crashing down, forming the the percussion marks. The larger rocks were carried along the surface, eroding the surface down. That's what does the erosion. They call them tools, geological jargon, and they erode the surface. And after the current wanes, it leaves a capping of these rounded rocks. That's how come you have 75 feet of them on the Cypress Hills. And based on civil engineering equations, open channel flow equations, we can put some minimum currents to these. A 6-inch bullet wide rock, which is like this, round and like the shape of a bullet, we figures this is the largest rock carried up in suspension and come crashing down, and implies currents over 65 miles an hour in water depths over 180 feet. So we put some numbers to these things. What is this saying? It's powerful evidence for the runoff of the floodwaters at high speeds, eroding, forming planation surfaces, then eroding those planation surfaces into erosional remnants. Here's a summary of the quartzite. They're spread 800 miles east from their source in the Western Rockies, west of the Continental Divide. They're spread 400 miles west of the Pacific Ocean. Percussion marks indicate torrential flow. Planation surfaces, long spread of quartzites, percussion marks aren't forming today. Powerful evidence for the flood runoff. So this is the last feature I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to open to questions and answers. I'm going to shifting to phase 5, the more channelized phase, where the water is forced to channelize around obstacles, forming more linear valleys and canyons rapidly. And a lot of times superimposed on the wide planation surface, like a Grand Canyon. You erode the whole area as a sheet flow, phase 4, and then you form Grand Canyon, Zion Canyon, and other canyons in southwest Colorado Plateau during the channelized flow phase. It's a great 1-2 punch, and one superimposed on the other. Exactly what you expect during flood runoff. So I'm going to talk about one landform for the channelized phase, and that's what's called water gaps. A water gap is essentially a gap through a mountain ridge or mountain range or even plateau where the water from a river or stream starts on one side and passes right through a gorge to the other side. They're called water gaps. And in my area, this is north central Wyoming. Here's a water gap right here through the Rattlesnake Mountains. Yellowstone Park is further to the west that you can't see, or maybe this mountain is part of it. But this is a range of mountains east of Yellowstone. And here's a gap, a cut through the mountains, kind of white at the top, and it narrows to very, very much like Grand Canyon, and that starts out wide and goes very narrow. And this is about 2 miles to the end there. Now, the Shoshone River starts in southeast Yellowstone Park, moves east out of the park, and comes to this Rattlesnake Mountains. Instead of going around it this way, like this, and come out near Cody, Wyoming, it continues east and cuts right through the Rattlesnake Mountains, which are 2,500 feet tall. That water gap's 2,500 feet, cut in hard granite, and the dipping sedimentary rocks. You see the sedimentary rocks dipping towards me, which is east, and there's granite in the center. Here's a close-up of it. Of course, they built a road through it, and in the water gap, they formed a dam. Good place to dam the Shoshone River, and that they did. Here's the water gap right here. Shoshone River goes through there, and here's the dam. Look at how low and wide that area is. The water, when the sediments were a little bit higher, say 100,000 years ago, the Shoshone River was running. It should have easily gone around those Rattlesnake Mountains there, out this way, and drained through the Bighorn Basin there at Cody. In fact, this is so low they had to form another dam there so the water wouldn't run out, and that's where they get their irrigation water. But the river ended up going through there. Why? Well, they don't know, but they have approximately four hypotheses for the origin of water gaps, which I've analyzed and published, which I'll give you some links on how you can get a hold of a lot more published information. And there's 1,700 water gaps through the Appalachian Mountains, through the ridges of the Appalachian. Here's a famous one north of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And this is the first of about 3 or 4 aligned water gaps, aligned in a curve, gentle curve like that. And you got to ask yourself, why did the river end up cutting through these ridges when it could have easily gone around the ridges? Because there are low spots that it just cut right through them. And there's 1,700 of them in the Appalachians alone. So water gaps, there's thousands of them across the surface of the earth on all continents. And I have analyzed them in southern England and in North America, including Alaska, west coast, east coast of the United States. And I've looked in the literature for places in Africa and Europe. They're there. Anyway, the guy did a PhD thesis on the Zagros water gaps in southwest Iran. And then he wrote a book. There's at least 300 water gaps in the Zagros Mountains, up to 8,000 feet deep, deeper than Grand Canyon, which is a long water gap. Grand Canyon is the longest, but not the deepest by far. The Zagros Mountains, the way he describes this is the rivers don't normally go down valleys like they're supposed to. Oh, they do for a little while. Then they cut through obstacles, mountains. And then not only do they cut out, they sometimes come back out. Really strange things. When I read this book, I was laughing all the way through it because they were all uniformitarian conundrums that can't be explained. And here's just one little quote from Thomas Oberlander, who's an expert on water gaps, I might add. The Zagros drainage pattern is distinctive by virtue of its disregard of major geological obstructions. Disregards them, both on a general scale and in detail, local scale. Certain streams ignore structure completely. Some, I like the wording here, some appear to seek obstacles to transect. Now, what kind of normal river is that? And this is not unusual. This is probably the best example in the world of the craziness of the drainage patterns of the world through water gaps. They can't explain them, even though they wing it. They try. They don't like to leave theoretical vacuum with no explanation. They always have explanations. You look at the explanations and you find out that they don't hold water either. And they're just winging it because they don't know what else to say. The deepest water gaps are in the Himalaya Mountains, where 9 rivers start in the southern Tibetan Plateau and they head for the Himalayas. And the mountains do cause them to, the rivers to form, go down the valleys for a while. Then suddenly they cut right through the mountains in deep water gaps. There's one water gap east of Mount Everest that is 4 miles deep, the Aran River that cuts through the Himalayas into the Indian Ocean. By the way, we have an analog for water, formation of water, and another thing called wind gaps, which I'm not going to get into. There's a lot of things I can't get into. I mean, I can write a 5,000-page book on all this. We have an analog in the Great Lake Missoula flood, in the Channel Scablands of Washington, my home state, which I've done a lot of research. I have one book and one DVD out on this topic. For Glacial Lake Missoula, 500 and some odd cubic miles of water by an ice dam in northern Idaho broke and emptied in 2 days and spread through eastern Washington, cutting up into deep canyons, flat bottom canyons called coulees there. And J. Harlan Bretz pointed this out in 1923. And no one believed him for 40 years. And they're all against him, as this quote says. They rejected it because they don't believe in floods this big. It was too biblical, some people said. We just don't believe it, period. Until they went out there, and then we had overhead pictures, and we could see ripple marks and gravel and many other features of flood, big gravel bars. But anyway, in the southern part, here's the Snake River right here. So I'm going to jump down to this right down in here. And in the Snake River, which is right here, between the Snake River and this Washtuckna Coulee, the Palouse River used to go down like this. But in the Lake Missoula flood coming down from the north, cut across this 500-foot high ridge and eroded in this area, about 8 miles wide here, and then narrowed down to a narrow canyon. After the flood, the Palouse River, instead of continuing down the Washtuckna Coulee, takes a left-hand turn through Palouse Canyon and into the Snake River. This is where a gigantic Lake Missoula flood formed water gap, as well as a wind gap over here I'm not going to talk about, in a monstrous flood. And here's kind of a summary of this. You had sheet flow transitioning into channelized flow. And so here you got a sheet flow going perpendicular to a ridge. The ridge is probably coming up and the waters are draining. Remember, the waters are draining during all this and the mountains are rising. And no ridge is perfectly flat, so the low areas end up being eroded more than the higher areas, and with time, the tops of this ridge show, and it funnels the water through these gaps. And then when it funnels it through, the same amount of water has to go through a more narrow area that's to accelerate. And the velocity of flow is approximately equal to the fourth power of the erosion. You cause 10 to the fourth erosion with a doubling of the current speed. Erosions to the 10th to the fourth power of the velocity. And here it's going through here too. But then with time, shifting currents, other features that happened during the flood, a lot of chaotic things occurred. And so all the water ended up flowing in deeper and deeper, and this gave up. And so at the end, it formed a deep water gap where the rivers will end up going through. And this left high and dry would be a wind gap, only winds going through it. You find thousands of wind gaps on ridges in the mountains too. So this can easily be explained by the flood, these water gaps. Yet they have 4 hypotheses which have serious problems. So I'm going to get back to why can't mainstream scientists see it? Why can't Davis Young and other geologists that teach on Christian campuses, but teach you evolution and deep time and uniformitarianism? Why can't they see it? Well, I think it's a psychological phenomenon. There's room for psychologists in all this. I picked this up from a book called The Promise of Sleep. Being a shift worker that worked rotating shifts for 30 years, I had sleep issues, so I wanted to know how to deal with it better. So I got this Dr. William Dement book. He was a professor at Stanford University. He was one of the discoverers of REM sleep. He says on page 34 of his book, by the way, you can get quotes from geologists that say the same thing. Even when they are looking, people usually see only what they expect to find, and they do not see what they assume for whatever reason could not exist. So those professors that teach on Christian campuses that got their education at secular universities got essentially brainwashed in uniformitarianism. So they got uniformitarian glasses on. So all they see is slow processes over millions of years. They don't see catastrophism out there, the tremendous evidence for the flood. And I only gave you a little tiny bit of the evidence. It's a psychological phenomenon. They don't believe it exists. They don't see it. Interesting. And by the way, one of the reasons that attracted me to this area is I was a weather forecaster for 30 years in the National Weather Service. And I did this to a lot of people. I ruined probably thousands of picnics and outdoor activities. Today's forecast, 100% chance of sunshine and pouring down rain. But of course, you know, the period of verification is 12 hours. And after the rain goes, you might see some sunshine. So in a way it could verify. But anyway, tell me why I should trust scientists when they can't even tell about the Earth over millions of years, when they cannot barely forecast the weather. By the way, we're doing a lot better job forecasting the weather, I might add. The models are doing, computer models are so much better. Anyway, if you want to know more about this, this is a summary of generally what I said, but more. And that is just a summary too. How Noah's flood shaped our Earth, just kind of an outline starting from before the flood and going through the phases of the flood in chronological order, and then talking about the ice age after the flood caused by the flood. And I've even written for children to explain a lot of this geology, exploring geology with Mr. Hibb. We have one about dinosaurs too. You can get it from Creation Ministries International. And I just wrote a book just recently about the time issue. I didn't get into that here. That's a whole different topic, lots of problems. It's called The Deep Time Deception, Examining the Case for Millions of Years. So I recommend those 3 books for those that want to search more. But I want to read you, leave you with a Bible quote from 1 Corinthians 2:5. Your faith should not rest on the wisdom of men. The wisdom of men trying to figure out earth science without God is where they get evolution, deep time, millions of years, and uniformitarianism, all under the aspect that God does not exist. We should not have our faith depend on that, but on God's power. God has the power to create, cause a flood, and all the miracles in the Bible are no sweat to him. If he can create the universe, it's a small thing to create a lot of aspects of the earth and do miracles. And here's some websites I want to leave you with. This is the final slide. Creation Encounters is a group that does tours in the Western US if you ever want to get involved in a tour. And probably most of you heard of these 4 major sites. Creation.com is CMI, Creation Ministries International. That's the one I mainly do my research with, but then there's Creation Research Society also, do a lot of research. I want to mention my website. On my website, I have 2 free ebooks in color. I have one about 800 pages, I think, going through what I've just talked about in more detail with color pictures throughout it. And it'll give you a lot more information about the runoff or the retreating stage of the flood. Then I got a second ebook on where is the flood post-flood boundary. And I go through about 32 evidences that it's in the late Cenozoic, assuming the geological column, but not any one spot because we can't depend on their precise dating methods. Generally in the late Cenozoic, which is defined as the Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene. And every area has to be examined on its own merits. I have seen places where it's probably in the Miocene and other places it's in the Pleistocene, using the geological column as a template. So now I will open it up to questions, and that's the end. And so.
Well, thank you, Mike. Let me remove this from the screen real quick. And I have to say that was yeah, looks like you're good. I got to say that was a remarkable presentation.
Yeah, well, thank you.
You're good.
How do I get off?
I think I think it's not shared anymore, so you should be good, Mike.
Okay. All right. I gotcha.
Awesome. Let me adjust my mic here. And I mean, just like the title of your lecture there's just so much astounding evidence for the global flood.
There is.
It brings
tremendous.
it's amazing, and it brings me to 2 Peter 3, where the scoffers are willingly ignorant of the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say God bless you for all your amazing work and research. You know, I'm not the only one who agrees that I very much appreciate it. And I like the way you ended it. You pointed out that it is a psychological issue.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, you could literally write a 10,000 page book on this. I've got a couple here that I'd like to recommend as well. Frozen in Time, on the mammoths. That's a great book.
And the Ice Age.
Yes. Yeah, and the Ice Age. This one has been a huge help for me. Rock Solid Answers.
Mm-hmm.
I think you co-authored this. So especially for the audience. We've got
edited on that with John Reed. We got a bunch of creation scientists to give us 14 geological challenges, and we gave answers about fairly detailed answers, and about an average of 20 pages each.
Yes. Yes, I felt they were very technical, very detailed answers, and it's a book that I wish everybody would have.